The vast expanse of the Central Asian steppes stretching from the Altai Mountains to the Caspian Sea witnessed the emergence of one of history's most enigmatic nomadic peoples during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. The Huns, whose very name would later strike terror into the hearts of settled populations from China to Rome, arose from this harsh landscape of endless grasslands, where survival demanded mobility, adaptability, and martial prowess. Understanding their origins requires piecing together fragmentary archaeological evidence, analysing Chinese historical records, and examining the complex interplay of environmental and demographic forces that shaped nomadic societies across Eurasia. Archaeological investigations across the steppes have revealed a complex picture of nomadic cultures that flourished in the centuries preceding the Huns' westward expansion. Excavations at sites like Noin Ula in Mongolia and Tilia Tepe in Afghanistan have uncovered burial complexes containing artifacts that suggest sophisticated trade networks and cultural exchanges spanning thousands of miles. The distinctive bronze cauldrons found at these sites, characterized by their mushroom-shaped handles and wide, shallow bowls, represent one of the most recognizable markers of Hun material culture. These vessels, often measuring over 2 feet in diameter, were not merely cooking implements, but served crucial ceremonial functions in nomadic society. Their distribution pattern across the steppes provides tangible evidence of cultural continuity and migration routes that would later be followed by the Huns themselves. The connection between the Huns and the Xiongnu Confederation presents one of the most debated questions in early nomadic history. Chinese sources, particularly the records of the Grand Historian, compiled by Sima Qian in the 1st century BCE, provide detailed accounts of the Xiongnu's political structure, military tactics, and territorial extent. The Xiongnu, who dominated the Mongolian steppes from approximately 209 BCE to 93 CE, established a sophisticated nomadic empire that challenged Han Chinese authority for centuries. Their political organization, based on a decimal system of military units and a complex hierarchy of tribal leaders, would later be echoed in Hun administrative practices observed by Roman and Byzantine chroniclers. Linguistic analysis has revealed intriguing parallels between terms used to describe Xiongnu social structures and later Hun terminology recorded in European sources. The Xiongnu title Chanyu, denoting supreme ruler, shares phonetic similarities with the Hun title Khan, suggesting possible linguistic continuity. Similarly, the Xiongnu practice of organizing their territory into left and right wings, with the heir apparent traditionally ruling the left wing, mirrors the dual leadership structures observed among the Huns during their European campaigns. These linguistic and organizational parallels, while not conclusive proof of direct descent, indicate significant cultural transmission across the steppes. The Book of the Later Han, compiled in the 5th century CE, describes the fragmentation of the Xiongnu Confederation following military defeats by Chinese forces and internal succession disputes. The northern Xiongnu, according to these sources, retreated westward after 91 CE, disappearing from Chinese records, but potentially carrying their cultural traditions and military expertise toward the western steppes. This westward movement coincides chronologically with the earliest archaeological evidence of Hun presence in the Volga-Ural region, suggesting a possible connection between the displaced Xiongnu and the emerging Hun confederations. Climate data reconstructed from ice cores and tree ring analysis reveal significant environmental pressures that likely influenced nomadic migration patterns during this period. The 1st and 2nd centuries CE experienced a cooling trend across Central Asia, accompanied by increased aridity in traditional grazing areas. These climatic shifts reduced the carrying capacity of pasture lands, forcing nomadic groups to seek new territories or intensify competition for existing resources. The resulting population pressures created a domino effect across the steppes, as displaced groups pushed westward in search of more favourable conditions. Archaeological evidence from the Aral Sea region indicates significant demographic changes during this period, with traditional settlement patterns disrupted and new burial practices appearing. The introduction of artificial cranial deformation, a practice previously unknown in the region, suggests the arrival of new populations with distinct cultural traditions. This practice, which involved binding infants' heads to create elongated skull shapes, would later become a characteristic feature of Hun elites, as documented by Roman historians who described their distinctive appearance. The material culture associated with early Hun populations reveals sophisticated technological adaptations to steppe warfare and nomadic life. Composite bows constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew represented the pinnacle of nomadic military technology. These weapons, measuring typically between 4 and 5 feet in length when strung, could accurately deliver arrows at distances exceeding 300 yards. The asymmetrical design, with the lower limb shorter than the upper, allowed for effective use from horseback while maintaining power and accuracy. Archaeological finds from Hunnic burial sites reveal arrows with distinctive trilobate iron heads specifically designed for penetrating armour and maximising tissue damage. The horse gear associated with Hun burials demonstrates remarkable craftsmanship and technological innovation. Bridle bits made from iron and bronze show sophisticated understanding of equine behaviour and control mechanisms. The development of rigid stirrups, appearing in Hun context during the 2nd century CE, revolutionised mounted warfare by providing riders with greater stability and leverage. This innovation would later spread westward with Hun migrations, fundamentally altering European cavalry tactics. Hun burial practices reveal a complex spiritual worldview that distinguished them from other nomadic groups. Unlike the elaborate kurgan burials of the Scythians or the simple pit graves of the many steppe peoples, Hun interments typically featured rectangular grave pits aligned east-west, with the deceased positioned on their side in a flexed position. Grave goods included not only weapons and horse gear, but also distinctive pottery vessels and bronze mirrors, suggesting beliefs about the afterlife that required specific material provisions. The practice of depositing dismembered horses in separate pits adjacent to human burials appears consistently in Hun archaeological contexts. These horse sacrifices, often involving multiple animals, indicate the central role of horses in Hun society and religious beliefs. The careful positioning of horse remains, with heads oriented toward the human burial, suggests ritualized practices that may have been intended to provide spiritual mounts for the deceased's journey to the afterlife. Pottery analysis from Hun sites reveals technological traditions distinct from surrounding cultures. Hun ceramics typically feature coarse temper and simple decorative schemes, contrasting sharply with the elaborate painted wares of sedentary populations. The prevalence of large storage vessels and portable cooking pots reflects the practical needs of nomadic life, while the absence of luxury ceramics suggests a society that valued portability over ostentation. The distribution of Chinese silk and Roman glass beads in Hun burial context demonstrates their integration into transcontinental trade networks. These luxury goods, found even in relatively modest graves, indicate that Hun society participated in the exchange systems that connected east and west across the Silk Road. The presence of cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean in Hun burials thousands of miles from their origin points to the extensive reach of these trade connections. Metalworking traditions among the Huns show influences from multiple sources, combining techniques from Chinese, Persian, and Scythian traditions. The production of distinctive belt plaques featuring animal motifs in the Scythian style, combined with Chinese-influenced decorative techniques, suggests cultural synthesis rather than simple adoption of foreign practices. This technological eclecticism would become a hallmark of Hun material culture throughout their expansion westward. The organisation of Hun settlements, as revealed through archaeological survey, differed significantly from both sedentary agricultural communities and other nomadic groups. Hun sites typically consist of scattered clusters of temporary structures with evidence of seasonal occupation patterns. The absence of permanent architecture and the prevalence of portable artefacts confirm their commitment to nomadic lifestyles, even when occupying favourable territories for extended periods. The westward momentum that had carried Hun confederations across the Central Asian steppes reached a critical juncture around 350 CE, when these nomadic warriors encountered the Volga River, the traditional boundary between Asia and Europe. The crossing of this mighty waterway marked not merely a geographical transition, but the beginning of a demographic and political upheaval that would reshape the entire European continent. The Volga, flowing over 2,000 miles from its source in the Valdai Hills to the Caspian Sea, had long served as both a natural barrier and a cultural divide between the nomadic peoples of the eastern steppes and the more settled populations of the western plains. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Middle Volga reveals the sudden appearance of distinctly Hun material culture during this period. Excavations at Shilovka and other settlements show layers of destruction followed by the introduction of new burial practices, pottery styles, and metalworking techniques characteristic of the eastern nomads. The stratigraphy at these sites tells a clear story of violent displacement, with burned structures and hastily buried hoards of valuables indicating the rapid abandonment of established communities. Carbon dating of these destruction layers consistently points to the mid-4th century, confirming the chronology suggested by later historical sources. The initial Hun incursions across the Volga brought them into immediate contact with the Alans, a powerful confederation of Sarmatian tribes who had dominated the region between the Volga and Don rivers for centuries. The Alans, themselves descendants of earlier Scythian populations, had established a sophisticated semi-nomadic society that combined pastoralism with limited agriculture and extensive trade networks. Their settlements, characterized by large earthwork fortifications and substantial timber buildings, represented a level of political organization that surpassed most purely nomadic societies. The Alan Confederation controlled crucial trade routes connecting the Black Sea region with Central Asia, making them wealthy intermediaries in the exchange of silk, spices, and precious metals. The first encounters between Huns and Alans occurred along the eastern banks of the Volga, where Alan herders traditionally pastured their cattle during summer months. Contemporary accounts preserved in later Armenian and Georgian chronicles describe these initial clashes as sudden and devastating. The Alans, accustomed to warfare against other Sarmatian tribes and occasional Roman expeditions, found themselves unprepared for the Hun style of combat. Their heavy cavalry, equipped with long lances and scale armour, proved ineffective against the mobility and archery skills of the Hun warriors. Hun military tactics during these early European campaigns demonstrated remarkable sophistication and adaptability. The nomads employed a multi-layered approach to warfare that combined strategic deception, psychological intimidation, and overwhelming firepower. Their primary tactical formation, known from later Roman descriptions, involved light cavalry archers arranged in multiple lines, with each rank firing in sequence to maintain continuous arrow volleys. This system, refined through centuries of steppe warfare, allowed Hun armies to deliver sustained missile attacks, while maintaining mobility and avoiding direct engagement with enemy heavy cavalry. The composite bow technology that gave Huns their decisive advantage represented the culmination of centuries of nomadic innovation. These weapons, constructed from carefully selected materials including mountain sheep horn, wild cherrywood, and specially processed sinew, required months of preparation and skilled craftsmanship. The horn, harvested from the inner curve of sheep horns, provided compression resistance, while the sinew backing supplied tensile strength. The wooden core, typically made from birch or maple, served as the structural foundation. When properly constructed, these bows could generate draw weights exceeding 160 pounds, launching arrows with sufficient force to penetrate mail armour at distances of over 200 yards. Hun arrows themselves represented specialised military technology designed for maximum effectiveness against various target types. Archaeological finds from battlefields along the Volga reveal 3 distinct arrowhead designs: broad-bladed hunting points for unarmoured targets, narrow bodkin points for penetrating mail, and distinctive 3-bladed heads designed to cause maximum bleeding in wounded enemies. The shafts, typically made from birch or ashwood, were carefully balanced and fletched with eagle or hawk feathers to ensure accuracy. The nocks were reinforced with horn or bone to withstand the tremendous forces generated by the composite bows. The psychological impact of Hun warfare proved as devastating as their physical weapons. The nomads deliberately cultivated an aura of supernatural terror through their appearance and behaviour. Hun warriors practiced artificial cranial deformation from infancy, creating elongated skull shapes that appeared alien to European populations. They scarified their faces with deep cuts that healed into permanent ritual scars, and many warriors filed their teeth to sharp points. Their clothing, made from the furs of steppe animals and decorated with human scalps and finger bones taken from enemies, reinforced their fearsome reputation. The Hun practice of feigned retreat, a tactic perfected through generations of steppe warfare, proved particularly effective against European opponents unfamiliar with nomadic fighting methods. Hun commanders would order apparent withdrawals, drawing enemy forces into extended pursuits across difficult terrain. When the pursuing forces became scattered and exhausted, the Huns would suddenly reverse direction, surrounding isolated groups and destroying them piecemeal. This tactic, requiring precise coordination and exceptional horsemanship, devastated Alan forces who expected conventional battle formations and direct confrontations. The technological superiority of Hun horse gear contributed significantly to their military success. Their horses, descendants of the hardy Przewalski breed, native to the Mongolian steppes, were smaller than European war horses but possessed superior endurance and agility. Hun horsemen used distinctive saddles with high cantles and pommels that provided secure seating during rapid manoeuvres. The development of iron stirrups, appearing in Hun context during the 4th century, gave their riders unprecedented stability for archery from horseback. These stirrups, featuring distinctive loop designs with flat treads, allowed Hun warriors to stand in their saddles while shooting, significantly improving their accuracy and range. The domino effect of Hun expansion began to manifest as displaced Alan populations fled westward, carrying news of the nomadic invasion to Gothic settlements along the Dniester and Dnieper rivers. The Alans, despite their military reputation, found themselves unable to mount effective resistance against Hun tactics. Their traditional reliance on heavy cavalry charges proved futile against enemies who refused direct engagement, preferring to harass and exhaust their opponents through continuous archery attacks. The psychological impact of Hun warfare, combined with their tactical superiority, led to the rapid collapse of Alan resistance. The Tervingi, the largest Gothic confederation west of the Dniester River, received the first refugees from the Hun advance during the late 350 SCE. These Gothic tribes, who had established themselves in the rich agricultural lands of modern-day Ukraine, had developed a semi-sedentary lifestyle that combined traditional Germanic social structures with adopted Sarmatian military techniques. Their king Athanaric ruled over a confederation of tribal groups that included not only ethnic Goths, but also assimilated Dacian, Sarmatian and Slavic populations. The Tervingi had grown wealthy through trade with the Roman Empire, exchanging furs, amber and slaves for Roman-manufactured goods, wine and luxury items. The arrival of Alan refugees brought disturbing reports of the Hun military capabilities and their apparent intention to continue westward. These accounts described armies that moved with unprecedented speed across vast distances, appearing suddenly to devastate settlements before disappearing back into the steppes. The refugees spoke of warriors who could accurately shoot arrows while riding at full gallop, of armies that seemed to materialize from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. The psychological impact of these reports began to undermine Gothic confidence even before direct contact with the Huns occurred. The Greuthungi, the Eastern Gothic confederation centred along the Dnieper River, found themselves in the direct path of Hun expansion. Led by their king Ermanaric, the Greuthungi had established one of the most powerful barbarian kingdoms beyond the Roman frontier. Their territory extended from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, encompassing diverse populations and vast agricultural resources. Ermanaric's kingdom represented the pinnacle of Gothic political development, featuring a complex administrative system that governed multiple tribal groups and maintained diplomatic relations with both Rome and Persia. The first direct encounters between Huns and Greuthungi occurred around 375 CE, when Hun raiding parties began probing Gothic defences along the Dnieper. These initial contacts revealed the fundamental mismatch between Gothic and Hun military systems. The Greuthungi, like other Germanic tribes, relied primarily on infantry formations supported by limited cavalry forces. Their warriors, equipped with spears, shields and swords, were trained for close combat in dense formations. This tactical approach, effective against other Germanic tribes and Roman legions, proved inadequate against the mobility and archery of the Huns. The Hun strategy against the Greuthungi involved systematic destruction of Gothic settlements and agricultural infrastructure. Rather than seeking immediate decisive battles, the nomads focused on disrupting the economic foundations of Gothic society. They targeted grain storage facilities, livestock herds and workshops, creating widespread famine and economic collapse. This approach, designed to force Gothic populations to abandon their territories, proved more effective than direct military confrontation in achieving Hun objectives. Roman awareness of the Hun threat developed gradually through reports from Gothic ambassadors and refugee accounts reaching the Danube frontier. The first official Roman acknowledgement of the Huns appears in correspondence between Emperor Valens and his generals stationed along the Danube, dating to approximately 376 CE. These documents, preserved in later Byzantine chronicles, describe barbarian disturbances of unprecedented scale affecting tribes throughout the region north of the Danube. Roman intelligence reports compiled by frontier commanders noted the sudden appearance of large refugee populations seeking shelter along the imperial border. The Roman military, accustomed to dealing with Germanic tribal migrations and raids, initially underestimated the significance of the Hun threat. Frontier commanders interpreted the early refugee movements as typical barbarian unrest, similar to previous episodes that had been contained through diplomatic negotiations and limited military intervention. The Romans had developed sophisticated systems for managing barbarian populations, including the settlement of federate tribes within imperial territory and the recruitment of barbarian warriors into Roman military units. These established procedures seemed adequate for addressing what appeared to be another cycle of tribal displacement. The distinctive nature of Hun warfare became apparent to Roman observers through interrogation of refugees and captured prisoners. Military reports describe weapons and tactics previously unknown along the European frontiers, including the systematic use of composite bows by entire armies and the employment of feigned retreat as a primary tactical method. Roman military manuals, which had codified centuries of experience in fighting Germanic and Sarmatian opponents, contained no effective countermeasures for the Hun style of warfare. The realization that existing military doctrine was inadequate for confronting this new threat began to emerge among Roman commanders during the late 370 SCE. The economic impact of Hun expansion reached Roman territories through disruption of established trade networks. The collapse of Gothic and Allan political structures eliminated crucial intermediaries in the exchange of goods between the Roman Empire and Central Asia. Roman merchants, accustomed to purchasing furs, amber, and slaves from Gothic traders, found their supply chains severed. The resulting shortages and price increases in luxury goods began to affect Roman urban populations, particularly in Constantinople and other major commercial centres. These economic disruptions provided Roman administrators with their first tangible evidence of the magnitude of the crisis developing beyond their frontiers. The devastating success of Hun expansion across the European steppes had created a vast nomadic empire by the early 5th century, but this sprawling confederation required sophisticated political structures to maintain cohesion and direct its military might. The Hun political system that emerged during this period represented a unique synthesis of traditional steppe governance and administrative innovations necessitated by ruling diverse sedentary populations. Unlike the relatively simple tribal structures of earlier nomadic societies, the Hun Confederation under Attila's predecessors developed complex hierarchies that could effectively coordinate military campaigns across thousands of miles while managing tribute collection, diplomatic relations, and the integration of conquered peoples. The dual kingship system that characterized Hun leadership during the 420s and early 430s CE reflected both practical administrative needs and traditional steppe political customs. Okta and Ruga, who ruled the Hun Confederation as co-kings during this crucial period, divided responsibilities according to geographical and functional lines that maximised their ability to control their vast territories. Okta, the elder brother, maintained authority over the eastern portions of the Hun Empire, including the traditional heartlands along the Volga and the recently conquered territories of the former Gruthungi kingdom. His court, established in a massive tent complex that could accommodate thousands of warriors and administrators, served as the primary centre for military planning and the coordination of campaigns against remaining Gothic holdouts and Slavic tribes. Ruga, controlling the western regions of the Hun Empire, focused his attention on relations with the Roman Empire and the management of Germanic federate tribes who had submitted to Hun authority. His administrative centre, located in the Carpathian Basin, became the focal point for diplomatic negotiations and tribute collection from Roman territories. The division of authority between the two brothers created a system of checks and balances that prevented the concentration of power in a single individual while ensuring that crucial decisions received input from multiple perspectives. This arrangement also provided redundancy in leadership, protecting the Confederation from the instability that typically followed the death of a single supreme ruler in nomadic societies. The transition from dual to unified leadership began with Ruga's death in 434 CE, an event that marked a crucial turning point in Hun political development. Rather than maintaining the traditional dual system, the succession passed to Ruga's nephews Attila and Bleda, who initially continued the co-rulership arrangement, but gradually moved toward a more centralized structure. The brothers' rise to power occurred during a period of increasing pressure from both Roman empires and growing complexity in managing the diverse populations under Hun control. Their joint accession represented not merely a continuation of existing practices, but a fundamental reorganization of Hun political authority. Attila, born around 406 CE, had spent his youth in the court of his uncle Ruge, receiving an education that combined traditional Hun warrior training with exposure to the diplomatic and administrative complexities of ruling a multi-ethnic empire. His early experiences included participation in raids against Gothic settlements, diplomatic missions to Roman territories, and the management of tribute collection from subject peoples. These formative experiences provided him with intimate knowledge of both Hun military capabilities and the political dynamics that held the Confederation together. His physical appearance, described by contemporary Roman sources, reflected the typical characteristics of Hun nobility: artificially elongated skull, ritual scarification on the face, and the distinctive clothing that marked his status within the nomadic hierarchy. Bleda, Attila's elder brother, had followed a similar path of preparation for leadership. but his temperament and interests differed significantly from those of his younger sibling. Where Attila demonstrated exceptional aptitude for military strategy and diplomatic manipulation, Bleda showed greater interest in the traditional aspects of nomadic culture, including the management of horse herds, the organisation of seasonal migrations, and the maintenance of relationships with tribal elders. This division of interests and capabilities initially complemented their joint rule, with Bleda handling internal affairs while Attila focused on external relations and military campaigns. The early years of Attila and Bleda's co-rulership witnessed significant expansion of Hun territorial control and the refinement of administrative systems necessary for governing their diverse subjects. The brothers implemented a sophisticated tribute collection system that extracted wealth from Roman territories while providing incentives for continued cooperation from Germanic and other barbarian tribes under Hun authority. This system, based on detailed records maintained by literate administrators recruited from conquered populations, represented a significant evolution from the simple raiding practices of earlier nomadic societies. The integration of subject peoples into the Hun military machine became one of Attila's primary concerns during the early years of his rule. The traditional Hun military structure, based on decimal organisation and clan-based units, required modification to accommodate the diverse fighting traditions and equipment of Germanic, Sarmatian, and other conquered peoples. Attila developed a flexible system that preserved the core Hun cavalry formations while incorporating Germanic infantry, Sarmatian heavy cavalry, and specialised units from other subject populations. This military integration served dual purposes. It increased the overall size and capabilities of Hun armies while creating bonds of loyalty between subject peoples and the Hun leadership. Germanic tribes that had submitted to Hun authority retained their traditional weapons and fighting techniques, but were organised into units commanded by Hun officers or Germanic nobles who had demonstrated loyalty to the Confederation. These Germanic contingents, equipped with their characteristic long spears, shields, and swords, provided the Hun armies with infantry capabilities that complemented their traditional cavalry strength. The integration process involved extensive training exercises where Germanic warriors learned to coordinate their movements with Hun cavalry tactics, creating combined arms formations that proved devastatingly effective against Roman forces. Sarmatian heavy cavalry, descendants of the Allan confederations that had been conquered during the initial Hun expansion, brought sophisticated armour-working techniques and battlefield experience that enhanced Hun military capabilities. These warriors, equipped with scale armour, long lances, and trained war horses, formed elite units within the Hun military hierarchy. Their integration required careful management of traditional Sarmatian pride and military customs, achieved through a system of honours and rewards that recognised their contributions while maintaining Hun supremacy within the command structure. The diplomatic relationship between the Hun Confederation and the Roman Empire during Attila's early reign represented a complex balance of military pressure, economic extraction, and political manipulation. The brothers inherited from their predecessors a tribute arrangement with the Eastern Roman Empire that provided substantial annual payments in gold, silk, and other luxury goods. This tribute, negotiated through a series of treaties beginning in the 420 SCE, represented Roman acknowledgement of Hun military superiority and their inability to defend their Danubian frontier against nomadic incursions. The Treaty of Margus, concluded in 435 CE shortly after Attila and Bleda's accession, established the framework for Hun-Roman relations during the crucial decade of Attila's consolidation of power. This agreement, negotiated by Roman ambassadors who travelled to the Hun court in the Carpathian Basin, doubled the annual tribute paid by Constantinople from £350 of gold to £700. The treaty also included provisions for the return of Hun refugees who had fled to Roman territory, the establishment of regulated trade relationships, and the recognition of Hun territorial claims south of the Danube River. The hostage exchange system that developed alongside these tribute arrangements served multiple diplomatic and political functions. Roman hostages, typically drawn from aristocratic families, lived in Hun courts where they served as guarantees of imperial compliance with treaty obligations. These hostages, often spending years among the Huns, provided valuable intelligence about Roman military capabilities and political developments. Simultaneously, Hun nobles sent to Roman territories gained exposure to imperial administrative practices and technological innovations that could be adapted for use within the nomadic confederation. The management of these diplomatic relationships required sophisticated understanding of Roman political dynamics and the ability to exploit divisions between the Eastern and Western empires. Attila demonstrated remarkable skill in playing the two Roman courts against each other, using threats of military action against one empire to extract concessions from the other. His diplomatic correspondence, preserved in fragmentary form in later Byzantine sources, reveals a leader who understood the psychological and political pressures affecting Roman decision-makers and could manipulate these factors to achieve Hun objectives. The consolidation of tribal confederations under Attila's leadership involved the systematic integration of diverse nomadic groups that had previously maintained independent or semi-independent status. The Akatsiri, a powerful confederation of tribes located between the Hun heartland and the Black Sea, represented one of the most significant challenges to Hun expansion during this period. These tribes, ethnically related to the Huns but politically independent, controlled crucial grazing lands and trade routes that Attila required for the continued expansion of his empire. The incorporation of the Akatsiri involved a combination of military pressure, diplomatic negotiation, and the strategic use of marriage alliances that bound their leadership to Hun interests. The process of tribal integration required careful attention to traditional customs and hierarchies that could not be simply abolished without risking rebellion. Attila developed a system of indirect rule that preserved the appearance of traditional tribal autonomy while ensuring effective Hun control over military and economic resources. Tribal leaders who submitted to Hun authority retained their titles and ceremonial functions, but operated under the supervision of Hun administrators who monitored their activities and ensured compliance with Confederation policies. The death of Bleda in 445 CE marked the culmination of Attila's rise to supreme power within the Hun Confederation. The circumstances surrounding Bleda's death remain controversial, with contemporary sources providing conflicting accounts of whether he died from natural causes, in hunting accidents, or through more sinister means. Roman historians, writing with the benefit of hindsight and obvious bias against Attila, suggested that the younger brother orchestrated his sibling's death to eliminate a potential rival. However, the evidence for fratricide remained circumstantial, and the transition to sole rule may have resulted from natural causes or genuine accidents. The consolidation of power following Bleda's death involved a systematic reorganization of Hun political and military structures that reflected Attila's vision of centralized authority. The traditional council of tribal elders, which had shared decision-making authority with the dual kings, found its influence significantly reduced as Attila concentrated power in his own hands and those of his closest advisors. This centralization process involved the appointment of Hun nobles to key administrative positions previously held by representatives of subject peoples, ensuring that crucial decisions remained under direct Hun control. The military reorganization that accompanied Attila's assumption of sole authority created a more efficient and responsive command structure capable of coordinating complex multi-front campaigns. The traditional decimal organization of Hun military units was expanded and refined, with clear chains of command extending from Attila himself down to individual squad leaders. This system, combined with improved communication methods and standardized equipment, transformed the Hun military from a collection of tribal warbands into a professional army capable of sustained operations across vast distances. The integration of diverse populations into this centralized system required innovative approaches to administration and communication. Attila's court employed scribes and administrators drawn from multiple ethnic and linguistic backgrounds, creating a multilingual bureaucracy capable of managing the complex relationships between different subject peoples. These administrators, many of whom had received Roman or Byzantine education, brought sophisticated record-keeping and organizational skills that enabled the efficient management of tribute collection, military recruitment, and diplomatic correspondence. The consolidation of absolute power under Attila's sole rule fundamentally transformed the Hun Confederation's relationship with the Roman Empire, shifting from the relatively manageable tribute arrangements of the dual kingship period to an aggressive expansionist policy that would bring Hun armies to the very gates of Constantinople. The death of Bleda in 445 CE removed the last significant constraint on Attila's ambitions, allowing him to pursue military campaigns of unprecedented scale and audacity. The Eastern Roman Empire, already strained by Persian conflicts, internal religious disputes, and the enormous financial burden of Hun tribute payments, found itself facing a nomadic leader whose strategic vision extended far beyond traditional raiding and tribute extraction. The immediate aftermath of Bleda's death witnessed intensive military preparations throughout Hun territories as Attila mobilized resources for campaigns that would dwarf previous nomadic incursions into Roman territory. The Hun war machine that emerged during this period represented the culmination of decades of military evolution, combining traditional steppe mobility and archery with sophisticated siege techniques learned from captured Roman engineers and Germanic craftsmen. Hun armies of the 440s included not only the traditional cavalry formations that had devastated Gothic and Alan resistance, but also specialized units trained in siege warfare, river crossing operations, and urban combat. The first major test of Attila's military reforms came with the Hun invasion of the Balkans in 441 CE, launched while Emperor Theodosius II was preoccupied with Persian frontier conflicts and internal religious controversies. The timing of this invasion demonstrated Attila's sophisticated understanding of Roman strategic priorities and his ability to exploit moments of imperial weakness. Roman intelligence networks, which had provided early warning of previous barbarian movements, failed to detect the massive concentration of Hun forces north of the Danube until the invasion was already underway. This intelligence failure reflected both the effectiveness of Hun operational security and the deterioration of Roman frontier surveillance capabilities. The Hun invasion force that crossed the Danube in 441 CE represented the largest nomadic army ever assembled for operations against Roman territory. Contemporary estimates, while certainly inflated, suggest that Attila commanded over 100,000 warriors drawn from dozens of tribal confederations across the European steppes. The core of this army consisted of approximately 30,000 traditional Hun cavalry, equipped with the composite bows and horse archery techniques that had proven so devastating against Gothic and Alan resistance. These elite units, organised according to the traditional decimal system, form the strategic reserve and primary striking force of the invasion. Germanic contingents totaling perhaps 40,000 warriors provided the invasion force with infantry capabilities essential for siege operations and urban warfare. These troops, drawn from Gepid, Ostrogothic and other tribal confederations that had submitted to Hun authority, retained their traditional weapons and fighting techniques while operating under Hun command structure. Their equipment included the characteristic long spears, round shields, and single-edged swords that had served Germanic warriors for centuries, supplemented by siege equipment and scaling ladders constructed specifically for the campaign. Sarmatian heavy cavalry, numbering approximately 15,000 riders, formed elite shock units within the Hun army. These warriors, descendants of the Alan confederations conquered during the initial Hun expansion, brought sophisticated armour-working techniques and battlefield experience that complemented Hun tactical doctrine. Their scale armour, constructed from thousands of small iron plates sewn onto leather backing, provided superior protection against Roman missiles, while maintaining sufficient flexibility for mounted combat. The long lances carried by Sarmatian cavalry, measuring up to 12 feet in length, proved particularly effective against Roman infantry formations. The strategic objective of the 441 CE invasion extended beyond simple raiding to the systematic conquest of key fortress cities that anchored Roman defences along the Danube frontier. Attila's target selection demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Roman military geography and the strategic importance of controlling major river crossings and road networks. The primary targets included Viminacium, the headquarters of the Moesian fleet and a crucial supply depot for Roman Danubian operations, and Singidunum, the fortress city that controlled the confluence of the Sava and Danube rivers. Viminacium, located at the junction of the Danube and Morava rivers in modern-day Serbia, represented one of the most formidable Roman fortifications along the northern frontier. The city's defences included massive stone walls reinforced with towers and bastions, extensive underground storage facilities, and a harbour complex that supported the Roman Danube fleet. The garrison, consisting of elements from the 7th Claudia Legion and various auxiliary units, totalled approximately 8,000 troops equipped with the latest Roman military technology. The city's strategic importance derived from its role as the primary supply base for Roman operations throughout the central Balkans and its control of river traffic between the upper and lower Danube. The Hun siege of Viminacium revealed the sophisticated siege warfare capabilities that Attila's forces had developed through the integration of Roman engineering techniques with traditional nomadic mobility. Hun engineers, many of whom were Roman prisoners or defectors with technical expertise, constructed massive siege towers that could be moved close to the city walls despite the defenders' missile fire. These towers, built from timber harvested from Carpathian forests and reinforced with iron fittings, stood over 60 feet tall and could accommodate hundreds of warriors equipped with scaling ladders and siege weapons. The siege techniques employed by Hun forces demonstrated remarkable adaptation of Roman military engineering principles to nomadic warfare requirements. Traditional Roman siege methods, which relied on extensive earthworks and permanent camps, were modified to accommodate the Hun preference for mobility and rapid deployment. Hun engineers developed portable siege equipment that could be quickly assembled and disassembled, allowing their armies to maintain strategic mobility while conducting extended siege operations. These innovations included collapsible siege towers, modular battering rams, and portable artillery pieces that could be transported by pack animals. The psychological warfare component of Hun siege operations proved as important as their technical capabilities. Hun forces systematically destroyed the agricultural infrastructure surrounding besieged cities, creating famine conditions that weakened defender morale and encouraged surrender. The nomads also employed terror tactics, including the public execution of captured prisoners and the display of severed heads on spears, designed to intimidate defenders and encourage civilian populations to pressure military commanders to surrender. These psychological operations, combined with the obvious technical sophistication of Hun siege equipment, created a climate of despair within besieged cities that often led to capitulation before walls were actually breached. The fall of Viminacium after a siege lasting 6 weeks demonstrated the effectiveness of Hun siege warfare and sent shockwaves throughout the Eastern Roman Empire. The city's capture eliminated a crucial Roman stronghold and provided Attila's forces with enormous quantities of military supplies, including siege engines, weapons, and provisions that would support continued operations. The systematic destruction of the Roman Danube fleet trapped in Viminacium's harbour eliminated imperial naval capabilities along the central Danube and opened river communications for Hun forces operating south of the frontier, Singidunum, the second major target of the 441 CE campaign, presented even greater challenges for Hun siege operations due to its strategic location and formidable defences. The city, positioned on elevated ground overlooking the confluence of the Sava and Danube rivers, commanded crucial river crossings and road networks connecting the Balkans with Central Europe. Its fortifications, recently upgraded with the latest Roman defensive technology, included multiple defensive lines, underground tunnels, and sophisticated artillery positions designed to maximize the effectiveness of defending forces. The siege of Singidunum lasted nearly 3 months and required the full application of Hun siege warfare capabilities. Attila's engineers constructed extensive earthworks that allowed Hun forces to approach the city walls despite heavy defensive fire from Roman artillery. These earthworks, including covered approaches and siege mounds, demonstrated the nomads' ability to conduct sustained engineering operations, requiring thousands of labourers and enormous quantities of materials. The siege also featured the first documented use of Hun siege artillery, including torsion engines captured from Roman arsenals and modified for nomadic warfare requirements. The successful capture of Singidunum completed the first phase of Attila's Balkan campaign and opened the road to the interior of the Eastern Roman Empire. The city's fall eliminated the last major Roman stronghold along the central Danube and provided Hun forces with a secure base for operations deeper into imperial territory. The enormous quantities of gold, weapons and supplies captured during the siege financed continued Hun operations and demonstrated the wealth that could be extracted from Roman territories through systematic conquest rather than simple raiding. The Roman response to the 441 CE invasion revealed the Empire's fundamental inability to mount effective resistance against Hun military capabilities. Emperor Theodosius II, preoccupied with Persian conflicts and religious controversies, could not deploy sufficient forces to counter the Hun invasion without compromising other strategic priorities. The limited Roman forces available for Balkan operations, consisting primarily of garrison troops and hastily assembled militia units, proved incapable of matching Hun mobility and tactical sophistication. Roman attempts to coordinate defensive operations were hampered by communication difficulties and the rapid pace of Hun advances. The devastating success of the 441-442 CE campaign established the foundation for even more ambitious Hun operations against the Eastern Roman Empire. The enormous wealth extracted from captured cities, combined with the military experience gained through siege operations, transformed the Hun Confederation into a formidable threat to Roman territorial integrity. The campaign also demonstrated Attila's ability to coordinate complex multi-front operations involving diverse military units and sophisticated logistical support systems. The second major Hun invasion of the Balkans, launched in 447 CE, represented the culmination of Attila's military ambitions and the greatest threat to Constantinople since the city's founding. This campaign, involving forces even larger than those employed in 441 CE, aimed at the systematic conquest of the entire Balkan Peninsula and the extraction of tribute payments that would effectively reduce the Eastern Roman Empire to vassal status. The timing of the invasion, coinciding with a devastating earthquake that damaged Constantinople's walls and internal political turmoil following the death of key imperial advisors, demonstrated Attila's continued ability to exploit Roman weaknesses. The 447 CE invasion force included not only the traditional Hun cavalry and Germanic infantry, but also specialised units trained specifically for urban warfare and siege operations. These forces, equipped with the latest siege technology and supported by engineers with extensive experience in Roman fortification systems, represented the most sophisticated nomadic army ever assembled for operations against settled populations. The campaign's objectives extended beyond simple conquest to the establishment of permanent Hun control over strategic territories that would support continued expansion into the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Hun advanced towards Constantinople in 447 CE, encountered minimal Roman resistance as imperial forces, weakened by previous defeats and demoralized by the apparent invincibility of Attila's armies, retreated toward the capital. The systematic destruction of Roman defensive positions and the capture of key supply depots eliminated the infrastructure necessary for sustained resistance. Hun forces reached the outer defences of Constantinople within weeks of crossing the Danube, creating panic within the capital and forcing Emperor Theodosius II to consider desperate measures for the city's defence. The sight of Hun armies camped within sight of Constantinople's walls represented the nadir of Eastern Roman military fortunes and the apparent triumph of nomadic warfare over imperial defensive capabilities. The massive tribute payments extracted through the subsequent Treaty of Anatolius would fundamentally alter the balance of power between the Roman Empire and the barbarian world, establishing precedents that would influence imperial policy for generations to come. The massive tribute payments extracted from the Eastern Roman Empire through the Treaty of Anatolius in 447 CE had established Attila as the dominant power in European politics, but the Hun king's ambitions extended far beyond the extraction of wealth from Constantinople. The systematic humiliation of the Eastern Empire, while financially rewarding, had demonstrated the limitations of purely tributary relationships with sedentary powers. Attila's strategic vision now encompassed the direct conquest and administration of Roman territories, beginning with the wealthy provinces of Gaul, where political instability and military weakness offered opportunities for permanent territorial acquisition. The diplomatic crisis that precipitated Attila's invasion of Gaul originated from an unexpected source within the imperial court of Ravenna. Honoria, sister of Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III, had become embroiled in a scandal involving an affair with her chamberlain Eugenius that threatened to destabilize the already precarious political situation in the Western Empire. The discovery of this relationship in 449 CE led to Eugenius's execution and Honoria's forced betrothal to Flavius Bassus Herculanus, a wealthy but politically insignificant senator chosen specifically to neutralize her potential influence on imperial succession. This arranged marriage, intended to resolve the immediate crisis, instead created the diplomatic pretext that Attila would exploit to justify his invasion of Gaul. Honoria's response to her enforced engagement revealed both desperation and remarkable political acumen. Rather than accepting her fate as a powerless pawn in imperial politics, she secretly dispatched her eunuch Hyacinthus to Attila's court with a letter requesting the Hun king's assistance in escaping her predicament. The letter, accompanied by her signet ring as authentication, contained language that Attila would later interpret as a formal marriage proposal and a request for military intervention. While Honoria's actual intentions remain debated by historians, her communication provided Attila with the legal justification he required for territorial claims against the Western Roman Empire. The Hun king's response to Honoria's overture demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of Roman law and diplomatic protocol. Rather than treating the communication as a simple request for assistance, Attila chose to interpret it as a formal marriage proposal that created legitimate claims to Western Roman territory. According to Roman inheritance law, Honoria's marriage to Attila would theoretically entitle him to half of the Western Empire as her dowry, a claim that provided legal cover for what was essentially a war of conquest. Attila's diplomatic correspondence with Ravenna, demanding recognition of his engagement to Honoria and the payment of her dowry and territorial concessions, revealed his ability to manipulate Roman legal traditions for his own strategic purposes. The territorial claims that Attila advanced based on his alleged engagement to Honoria extended far beyond any reasonable interpretation of Roman inheritance law. The Hun king demanded control of the entire Gallic prefecture, including the wealthy provinces of Lugdunensis, Belgica, and Narbonensis, as well as significant portions of the German territories along the Rhine frontier. These demands, if accepted, would have reduced the Western Roman Empire to little more than Italy and parts of Iberia, effectively ending its status as a major power. The extravagant nature of these claims suggests that Attila never expected their acceptance, but rather intended to use their inevitable rejection as justification for military action. Emperor Valentinian III's response to Attila's demands revealed the Western Empire's fundamental weakness and the limited options available to imperial policymakers. The emperor's initial attempts to resolve the crisis through diplomatic negotiation, including offers of increased tribute payments and territorial concessions in less strategically important regions, demonstrated his awareness of the empire's military inferiority. However, the magnitude of Attila's demands made any negotiated settlement impossible without effectively surrendering imperial sovereignty. The rejection of Attila's claims, while politically necessary, provided the Hun king with the pretext he required for the invasion of Gaul. The Hun army that assembled for the invasion of Gaul represented the largest military force ever organised by a nomadic confederation. Contemporary estimates, while certainly exaggerated, suggest that Attila commanded over 200,000 warriors drawn from dozens of tribal groups across the European steppes. The core of this massive army consisted of approximately 50,000 traditional Hun cavalry, organised according to the decimal system that had proven so effective in previous campaigns. These elite units, equipped with the composite bows and horse archery techniques that had devastated Roman and Gothic resistance, formed the strategic reserve and primary striking force of the invasion. Germanic contingents provided the bulk of the invasion force, with Ostrogothic, Gepid, Rugian, and other tribal confederations contributing an estimated 80,000 warriors to Attila's army. These troops, while retaining their traditional weapons and fighting techniques, had been integrated into Hun command structures through years of joint operations and shared military experiences. Their equipment reflected the diverse origins of the Confederation, ranging from the characteristic long spears and round shields of the Ostrogoths to the sophisticated armour and weapons of the Gepids, who'd adopted many Roman military technologies through their proximity to imperial territories. Sarmatian heavy cavalry, numbering approximately 20,000 riders, formed elite shock units within the Hun army. These warriors, descendants of the Alan confederations conquered during the initial Hun expansion, brought sophisticated metalworking techniques and battlefield experience that complemented Hun tactical doctrine. Their scale armour, constructed from thousands of small iron plates, provided superior protection against Roman missiles, while maintaining the flexibility necessary for mounted combat. The long lances carried by Sarmatian cavalry, measuring up to 14 feet in length, proved particularly effective against Roman infantry formations and cavalry charges. The logistical organisation required to support such a massive army demonstrated the sophisticated administrative capabilities that the Hun Confederation had developed under Attila's leadership. The invasion force required thousands of tons of supplies, including grain, preserved meat, and fodder for the enormous horse herds that accompanied the army. Hun quartermasters, many of whom had learned Roman administrative techniques through service in imperial territories, organised supply trains that could maintain the army's mobility while ensuring adequate provisions for extended operations. The integration of captured Roman transport equipment, including wagons and pack animals, with traditional nomadic logistics, created a supply system capable of supporting operations across the vast distances involved in the Gallic campaign. The route selected for the invasion of Gaul reflected Attila's strategic understanding of European geography and his desire to maximise the psychological impact of the Hun advance. Rather than taking the direct route through the Alpine passes, which would have exposed his army to Roman defensive positions and difficult terrain, Attila chose to approach Gaul through the Germanic territories along the Rhine frontier. This route, while longer, offered several strategic advantages. It allowed the Hun army to gather additional Germanic allies, avoided the strongest Roman fortifications, and created uncertainty about Attila's ultimate objectives. The Hun army's passage through Germania created a wave of destruction that eliminated potential threats to Attila's rear areas while demonstrating the consequences of resistance to remaining Germanic tribes. The systematic destruction of Frankish settlements along the Rhine, including the massacre of populations that had maintained friendly relations with Rome, served both strategic and psychological purposes. These operations eliminated potential sources of intelligence for Roman forces while creating refugee populations that would strain imperial resources and spread panic throughout Gaul. The siege and destruction of Metz in early 451 CE provided the first major test of Hun siege warfare capabilities in the Western theatre and demonstrated the evolution of nomadic military technology since the Balkan campaigns of the 440 S Metz, located at the confluence of the Moselle and Selle rivers, occupied a strategic position that controlled communications between the Rhine frontier and the interior of Gaul. The city's fortifications, recently upgraded with the latest Roman defensive technology, included massive stone walls reinforced with towers and bastions, extensive underground storage facilities, and sophisticated artillery positions designed to maximize the effectiveness of defending forces. The Hun siege of Metz revealed significant improvements in nomadic siege warfare since the capture of Viminacium and Singidunum. Hun engineers had developed more sophisticated siege equipment, including improved battering rams, more effective siege towers, and portable artillery pieces that could be quickly deployed against defensive positions. The siege also featured the first documented use of incendiary weapons by Hun forces, including fire arrows and combustible materials that could be launched over city walls to create fires within urban areas. These technological innovations, combined with the psychological impact of Hun terror tactics, reduced the time required to capture fortified positions. The systematic destruction of Metz following its capture served multiple strategic purposes beyond simple revenge or intimidation. The elimination of the city's defensive capabilities removed a potential stronghold that could threaten Hun communications with their Germanic territories. The massacre of the population, while brutal, eliminated potential sources of intelligence for Roman forces and demonstrated the consequences of resistance to other Gallic cities. The destruction of the city's infrastructure, including bridges, roads, and storage facilities, disrupted Roman logistics and forced imperial commanders to modify their defensive plans. The formation of the Romano-Visigothic alliance represented one of the most significant diplomatic achievements in late Roman history and demonstrated the empire's ability to overcome traditional animosities when facing existential threats. The alliance between Aetius, the Western Roman Empire's Magister Militum, and Theodoric I, king of the Visigoths, required both leaders to set aside decades of conflict and mutual suspicion in favour of cooperation against the Hun threat. This diplomatic revolution reflected the recognition that neither Roman nor Visigothic forces alone possessed the military capabilities necessary to defeat Attila's massive army. Flavius Aetius, the architect of the anti-Hun alliance, brought to the coalition a lifetime of experience in barbarian warfare and intimate knowledge of Hun military capabilities. His early career had included service as a hostage in Attila's court, where he had observed Hun military organisation and tactical methods firsthand. This experience, combined with his subsequent campaigns against various Germanic tribes, had provided him with unique insights into the strengths and weaknesses of nomadic warfare. Aetius's reputation as the last great Roman general of the Western Empire was based on his ability to coordinate diverse military forces and exploit enemy weaknesses through superior strategic planning. Theodoric I, king of the Visigoths, controlled one of the most powerful Germanic kingdoms in Western Europe and commanded military forces that had proven their effectiveness against both Roman and barbarian opponents. The Visigothic kingdom, centred in southwestern Gaul with its capital at Toulouse, had developed sophisticated military institutions that combined traditional Germanic warrior culture with Roman tactical innovations. Visigothic armies featured heavy cavalry equipped with mail armour and long lances, supported by infantry formations armed with spears, shields, and the distinctive single-edged swords that had become characteristic of Germanic warfare. The strategic importance of preventing Hun control of Gaul extended far beyond the immediate military threat posed by Attila's invasion. Gaul represented one of the wealthiest and most strategically important provinces of the Western Roman Empire, providing crucial tax revenues, military recruits, and agricultural production that supported imperial operations throughout Western Europe. The loss of Gaul would have reduced the Western Empire to little more than Italy and parts of Iberia, effectively ending its status as a major power and leaving it vulnerable to subsequent attacks from multiple directions. The alliance negotiations between Aetius and Theodoric required careful management of competing interests and traditional animosities that had characterized Romano-Visigothic relations for decades. The Visigoths had established their kingdom in Gaul through conquest of Roman territories, and their continued expansion had been one of the primary threats facing the Western Empire throughout the early 5th century. The temporary suspension of these conflicts in favour of cooperation against the Huns represented a remarkable diplomatic achievement that required both leaders to convince their followers of the necessity of working with traditional enemies. The military preparations for the campaign against Attila involved the coordination of diverse forces with different equipment, training, and tactical traditions. Roman forces contributed by Aetius included elements of the field army, auxiliary units recruited from various barbarian tribes, and militia formations drawn from Gallic cities. These troops, while experienced in frontier warfare, had limited experience in large-scale pitched battles against nomadic opponents. Their equipment reflected the evolution of late Roman military technology, including improved armour, more effective missile weapons, and siege equipment adapted for field operations. Visigothic military contributions to the alliance included the elite heavy cavalry that formed the core of Theodoric's army, supported by infantry formations and specialised units trained in specific tactical roles. The integration of Visigothic forces with Roman units required extensive coordination and joint training exercises designed to ensure effective cooperation during combat operations. The different command structures, tactical doctrines, and equipment standards of the Allied forces created significant challenges that required careful management by both Aetius and Theodoric. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains, fought near the city of Châlons-en-Champagne in June 451 CE, represented the culmination of the opposing strategic visions that had brought the largest armies in European history into direct confrontation. The battlefield, selected by mutual consent after several days of manoeuvring, consisted of rolling plains that provided adequate space for the massive armies while offering tactical advantages to both sides. The relatively open terrain favoured the mobility of Hun cavalry, while providing sufficient room for the deployment of the large infantry formations that formed the backbone of the Romano-Visigothic alliance. The military tactics employed during the battle reflected the diverse composition and capabilities of the opposing armies. Attila's deployment placed his most reliable Hun cavalry in the centre of his battle line, with Germanic allies positioned on the flanks where their infantry capabilities could be most effectively utilised. This formation, designed to maximise the impact of Hun archery while providing adequate support from Allied forces, represented the culmination of decades of tactical evolution within the nomadic confederation. The Hun centre, consisting of approximately 30,000 elite cavalry archers, formed a dense formation capable of delivering devastating missile attacks against enemy formations. The Romano-Visigothic deployment reflected Aetius's understanding of Hun tactical preferences and his determination to neutralise the advantages of nomadic warfare. The Allied centre, consisting of Roman infantry and auxiliary units, was positioned to absorb the initial Hun assault while maintaining sufficient cohesion to support counterattacks. Visigothic heavy cavalry, positioned on the right flank, was tasked with breaking through Hun-allied formations and attacking the nomadic centre from the side. This tactical plan required precise coordination between diverse military units and depended on the ability of Roman forces to withstand the initial Hun assault. The battle's opening phases witnessed the full display of Hun military capabilities as thousands of composite bows launched coordinated volleys against the Allied formations. The psychological impact of these attacks, combined with their physical effectiveness, created initial panic within some Allied units that had never experienced the intensity of nomadic archery. However, the superior armour and training of Roman and Visigothic forces, combined with their disciplined formations, allowed them to maintain cohesion despite heavy casualties. The effectiveness of Hun archery was reduced by the Allies' use of large shields and their ability to maintain tight formations that minimised individual exposure to missile fire. The death of Theodoric I during the battle's climactic phase represented both a personal tragedy and a strategic turning point that influenced the engagement's ultimate outcome. The Visigothic king, leading a cavalry charge against Hun positions, was struck down by a javelin and trampled by his own horses during the confusion of melee combat. His death, while devastating to Visigothic morale, was kept secret by his bodyguards until the battle's conclusion, preventing the collapse of Allied resistance at a crucial moment. The loss of Theodoric's leadership experience and tactical expertise significantly impacted the Allies' ability to coordinate complex maneuvers during the battle's later phases. The strategic implications of the Battle of the Catalonian Plains extended far beyond the immediate military outcome to influence the future development of European civilization. While neither side achieved decisive victory, the battle demonstrated that Hun military supremacy was not absolute, and that coordinated resistance could successfully challenge nomadic expansion. The enormous casualties suffered by both armies, estimated at over 50,000 dead, eliminated significant portions of the military forces available to all participants and fundamentally altered the balance of power in Western Europe. The aftermath of the Battle of the Catalonian Plains left Attila's military reputation intact despite the tactical stalemate that had prevented decisive victory over the Romano-Visigothic alliance. The enormous casualties suffered by both armies, while devastating to all participants, had not fundamentally altered the strategic balance of power in Western Europe. Hun forces retained their organisational cohesion and tactical superiority, while the death of Theodoric I had weakened the Visigothic contribution to any future anti-Hun coalition. More significantly, the unresolved dispute over Honoria's marriage proposal continued to provide Attila with legal justification for territorial claims against the Western Roman Empire, creating the diplomatic pretext for renewed military action. The strategic decision to invade Italy represented a fundamental shift in Hun military objectives from the tributary extraction that had characterized previous campaigns to direct territorial conquest aimed at establishing permanent nomadic control over the heartland of the Western Roman Empire. This decision reflected Attila's recognition that the inconclusive results in Gaul had demonstrated the limitations of traditional nomadic warfare against coordinated resistance from multiple opponents. The Italian peninsula, with its mountainous terrain and limited number of invasion routes, offered different tactical challenges but also presented opportunities for decisive strategic results that had been elusive in the open plains of Gaul. The diplomatic crisis surrounding Honoria's status had intensified rather than diminished following the Gallic campaign, as Emperor Valentinian III continued to refuse recognition of Attila's marriage claims while simultaneously being unable to resolve the underlying succession issues that had created the controversy. Honoria herself remained under virtual house arrest in Ravenna, her forced engagement to Flavius Bassus Herculanus having proceeded despite her obvious reluctance and continued secret communications with Hun representatives. The emperor's inability to either satisfy Attila's demands or definitively end the diplomatic dispute created a state of perpetual tension that could only be resolved through military action. The Hun king's decision to invade Italy during 452 CE was influenced by several strategic considerations beyond the immediate Honoria controversy. Intelligence reports from Hun agents operating within Roman territories indicated significant weaknesses in Italian defences, with many frontier fortifications undermanned and key military units still recovering from losses sustained during the Gallic campaign. The Western Roman Empire's financial resources had been severely strained by the costs of the previous year's military operations, limiting the imperial government's ability to recruit additional troops or strengthen defensive positions. These conditions created a window of opportunity that Attila was determined to exploit before Roman military capabilities could be restored. The invasion force assembled for the Italian campaign, while smaller than the massive army that had invaded Gaul, represented a more carefully selected and strategically focused military instrument. Attila commanded approximately 80,000 warriors, including 25,000 elite Hun cavalry, who formed the core of his striking force. These traditional Hun units, equipped with their characteristic composite bows and trained in the horse archery techniques that had proven so devastating in previous campaigns, provided the mobility and firepower necessary for rapid advances across the Italian peninsula. The reduction in overall army size reflected lessons learned from the Gallic campaign, where the logistical challenges of supporting such massive forces had sometimes hindered operational flexibility. Germanic contingents contributed approximately 35,000 warriors to the invasion force, drawn primarily from Ostrogothic and Gepid tribal confederations that had demonstrated exceptional loyalty during previous campaigns. These troops, while maintaining their traditional weapons and fighting techniques, had been thoroughly integrated into Hun command structures through years of joint operations. Their equipment reflected the diverse origins of the Confederation, with Ostrogothic warriors carrying their characteristic long spears and round shields, while Gepid forces featured more sophisticated armour and weapons acquired through their proximity to Roman territories and extensive trade networks. Sarmatian heavy cavalry, numbering approximately 12,000 riders, formed elite shock units within the invasion force. These warriors, descendants of the Alan confederations conquered during the initial Hun expansion, brought specialised skills in siege warfare and urban combat that would prove crucial during operations against Italian cities. Their scale armour, constructed from thousands of small iron plates sewn onto leather backing, provided superior protection against Roman defensive weapons, while maintaining the flexibility necessary for the rapid manoeuvres that characterised Hun tactical doctrine. The invasion route selected by Attila demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of Italian geography and his determination to maximise the psychological impact of the Hun advance. Rather than attempting the direct but difficult approach through the Alpine passes, which would have exposed his army to Roman defensive positions and challenging terrain, Attila chose to enter Italy through the Venetian plain via the passes of the Julian Alps. This route, while requiring careful timing to avoid winter weather conditions, offered several strategic advantages. It bypassed the strongest Roman fortifications, allowed rapid deployment across the fertile plains of northern Italy, and created direct threats to the wealthy cities that formed the economic foundation of imperial power. The Hun army's approach through the Julian Alps encountered minimal Roman resistance, as imperial forces had concentrated their limited resources on defending the more traditional invasion routes through the western Alpine passes. The rapid Hun advance across the mountainous terrain surprised Roman commanders who had expected nomadic forces to avoid difficult topography in favour of easier but more heavily defended approaches. This strategic deception allowed Attila's army to emerge onto the Venetian plain, with their forces intact and their operational objectives still concealed from Roman intelligence networks. The systematic destruction of northern Italian cities that followed the Hun emergence onto the Venetian plain represented one of the most devastating campaigns of urban warfare in ancient history. Attila's forces, operating with the tactical flexibility that had characterized their previous campaigns, divided into multiple columns that could simultaneously threaten several urban centres while maintaining the concentration necessary for decisive siege operations. This approach created panic throughout the region as city populations, uncertain of Hun intentions and unable to coordinate effective resistance, faced the prospect of systematic destruction. Aquileia, the first major city to face Hun assault, occupied a strategic position at the head of the Adriatic Sea that controlled communications between Italy and the Danubian provinces. The city's fortifications, constructed during the 3rd century CE and recently upgraded with the latest Roman defensive technology, included massive stone walls reinforced with towers and bastions, extensive underground storage facilities, and sophisticated artillery positions designed to maximize the effectiveness of defending forces. The garrison, consisting of elements from various legions and auxiliary units, totaled approximately 6,000 troops equipped with the standard Roman military equipment of the period. The siege of Aquileia revealed the continued evolution of Hun siege warfare capabilities since their successful operations against Balkan cities during the 440 S. Hun engineers had developed more sophisticated siege equipment, including improved battering rams constructed from massive timber beams reinforced with iron fittings, and siege towers that could be quickly assembled from prefabricated components. The siege also featured extensive use of incendiary weapons, including fire arrows and combustible materials that could be launched over city walls to create devastating fires within urban areas. These technological innovations, combined with the psychological impact of Hun terror tactics, significantly reduced the time required to capture fortified positions. The Hun assault on Aquileia's walls began with coordinated archery attacks designed to suppress Roman defensive fire and create opportunities for the deployment of siege equipment. Thousands of composite bows launched continuous volleys against the city's defenders, forcing Roman soldiers to seek shelter behind their fortifications and reducing their ability to interfere with Hun engineering operations. The accuracy and volume of Hun archery, delivered by warriors who had trained in these techniques from childhood, created conditions that allowed siege towers and battering rams to be moved into position despite the defenders' desperate resistance. The siege towers employed during the assault on Aquileia demonstrated significant improvements in Hun engineering capabilities since their previous urban warfare operations. These structures, standing over 70 feet tall and constructed from timber harvested from alpine forests, could accommodate hundreds of warriors equipped with scaling ladders and close combat weapons. The towers featured multiple levels connected by internal ladders, allowing Hun forces to maintain continuous pressure against different sections of the city walls while protecting their warriors from defensive missile fire. Iron-reinforced wheels and sophisticated pulley systems enable these massive structures to be moved into position despite their enormous weight. The systematic destruction of Aquileia, following its capture after a siege lasting 14 weeks, served multiple strategic purposes beyond simple revenge or intimidation. The elimination of the city's defensive capabilities removed a potential stronghold that could threaten Hun communications with their alpine territories. The massacre of the population, while brutal by modern standards, eliminated potential sources of intelligence for Roman forces and demonstrated the consequences of resistance to other Italian cities. The destruction of the city's infrastructure, including the harbour facilities that connected northern Italy with Danubian trade routes, disrupted Roman logistics and forced imperial commanders to modify their defensive plans. The flight of Aquileia's surviving population to the lagoon settlements of the northern Adriatic created refugee communities that would eventually develop into the city of Venice. These displaced populations, carrying with them the skills and cultural traditions of their destroyed homeland, established temporary settlements on the islands and sandbars of the Venetian lagoon where they could find protection from further Hun attacks. The difficult terrain of the lagoon, with its complex network of channels and tidal flats, provided natural defences that nomadic cavalry could not easily penetrate, creating a sanctuary for refugees from Hun devastation. The establishment of these lagoon settlements represented a direct consequence of Hun military success and demonstrated the long-term demographic impact of nomadic warfare on European civilization. The refugees who fled to the lagoons brought with them not only their personal possessions, but also their knowledge of Roman administrative practices, commercial networks, and maritime technologies. These skills, combined with the strategic advantages of their island locations, would eventually enable the development of the commercial empire that would make Venice one of the wealthiest cities in medieval Europe. Altinum, the second major city to face Hun assault, occupied a strategic position on the Venetian mainland that controlled communications between the Alpine passes and the Adriatic coast. The city's location at the intersection of several major Roman roads made it a crucial logistical centre for imperial operations throughout the region. Its fortifications, while not as extensive as those of Aquileia, included substantial stone walls and defensive towers that had been recently reinforced in anticipation of barbarian attacks. The garrison, consisting of approximately 3,000 troops drawn from various auxiliary units, was commanded by experienced officers who had participated in previous campaigns against Germanic tribes. The Hun siege of Altinum lasted only 6 weeks, reflecting both the improved efficiency of nomadic siege warfare and the psychological impact of Aquileia's destruction on the defenders' morale. The city's population, having witnessed the systematic destruction of their neighbour, understood the consequences of prolonged resistance and pressured military commanders to seek terms rather than face inevitable massacre. This psychological warfare, which had become an integral component of Hun military strategy, proved as effective as their technical siege capabilities in reducing the time and resources required for urban conquest. The destruction of Altinum eliminated another crucial link in the Roman defensive network protecting northern Italy, and provided Hun forces with additional supplies and equipment for continued operations. The systematic dismantling of the city's fortifications removed potential strongholds that could threaten Hun rear areas, while the capture of Roman military supplies enhanced the nomad siege warfare capabilities. The refugee populations that fled Altinum joined those from Aquileia in the lagoon settlements, contributing to the growing communities that would eventually coalesce into Venice. Patavium, modern Padua, represented the third major urban centre to face Hun assault during the systematic destruction of northern Italian cities. The city's strategic importance derived from its position at the intersection of several major Roman roads and its role as a commercial centre connecting the Alpine regions with the Adriatic coast. Patavium's fortifications, constructed during the 2nd century CE and recently upgraded, included substantial stone walls reinforced with towers and sophisticated defensive positions designed to maximise the effectiveness of defending forces. The city's garrison, totalling approximately 4,000 troops, included elements from regular legions and auxiliary units equipped with the latest Roman military technology. The siege of Patavium revealed the continued refinement of Hun siege warfare techniques and their ability to adapt their tactics to different defensive configurations. The city's walls, constructed on elevated ground that provided natural defensive advantages, required modified siege approaches that took advantage of the terrain while maintaining the mobility that characterized nomadic warfare. Hun engineers developed specialized siege equipment, including portable ramps and scaling devices that could be quickly deployed against elevated defensive positions without requiring the massive earthworks typically associated with Roman siege operations. The psychological impact of the systematic destruction of northern Italian cities extended far beyond the immediate military consequences to influence the political and social development of the entire region. The refugee populations that fled to the lagoon settlements carried with them not only their personal possessions, but also their cultural traditions, commercial knowledge, and technological skills. These displaced communities, while initially focused on simple survival, gradually developed the maritime capabilities and commercial networks that would eventually transform the Venetian lagoon into one of Europe's most important economic centres. The famous meeting between Attila and Pope Leo I at the river Mincio near Mantua represented one of the most significant diplomatic encounters in European history and marked the beginning of the end of the Hun invasion of Italy. The circumstances that led to this meeting reflected the complex political and military situation that had developed following the systematic destruction of northern Italian cities. Emperor Valentinian III, unable to mount effective military resistance against Hun forces, had fled from Ravenna to Rome, leaving the defence of Italy to local commanders and civilian authorities. The Pope, as the most influential remaining authority in the region, assumed responsibility for negotiating with Attila in an attempt to prevent the complete destruction of Roman civilization in Italy. The historical sources describing the meeting between Attila and Pope Leo I present conflicting accounts of the negotiations and their outcomes, reflecting the different perspectives and political interests of the chroniclers who recorded these events. Roman sources, particularly those written by Christian historians, emphasized the Pope's spiritual authority and divine intervention in persuading Attila to withdraw from Italy. These accounts, while valuable for understanding contemporary Roman perspectives, were clearly influenced by religious and political considerations that may have distorted the actual circumstances of the negotiations. Hun and Germanic sources preserved in fragmentary form through later Byzantine and medieval chronicles provide different perspectives on the meeting that emphasize practical rather than spiritual considerations. These accounts suggest that Attila's decision to withdraw from Italy was influenced by a combination of military, logistical, and political factors, rather than solely by the Pope's persuasive abilities. The diplomatic negotiations, according to these sources, involved substantial tribute payments and territorial concessions that provided Attila with tangible benefits in exchange for ending his Italian campaign. The role of plague in influencing Attila's decision to retreat from Italy represented a crucial factor that contemporary sources often minimized or ignored due to their focus on political and military developments. Archaeological evidence from Hun burial sites dating to this period reveals increased mortality rates and burial practices consistent with epidemic disease, suggesting that Attila's army had been significantly weakened by illness during the Italian campaign. The crowded conditions and limited sanitation facilities that characterized nomadic military camps made Hun forces particularly vulnerable to diseases that spread rapidly through close contact between infected individuals. Supply shortages also played a significant role in Attila's strategic calculations regarding the continuation of his Italian campaign. The systematic destruction of northern Italian cities, while demonstrating Hun military capabilities, had also eliminated potential sources of supplies and provisions that the nomadic army required for sustained operations. The difficult terrain of the Italian peninsula, with its mountainous regions and limited grazing areas, presented logistical challenges that differed significantly from the open plains where Hun forces had previously operated. These supply difficulties, combined with the onset of winter weather conditions, created practical constraints that influenced Attila's decision to withdraw. Eastern Roman military pressure along the Danube frontier represented another crucial factor that influenced Attila's strategic calculations during the Italian campaign. Emperor Marcian, who had assumed power in Constantinople following the death of Theodosius II, had adopted a more aggressive policy toward the Hun Confederation that included the cessation of tribute payments and the deployment of military forces along the Danubian frontier. These developments threatened Hun control over their traditional territories and created the possibility of coordinated attacks from multiple directions that could overwhelm even Attila's military capabilities. The Byzantine military preparations along the Danube involved the deployment of substantial forces equipped with the latest Roman military technology and supported by sophisticated intelligence networks that monitored Hun activities throughout the Balkans. These forces, while not immediately threatening to Hun territorial control, represented a potential threat that required Attila to maintain significant military resources for defensive purposes. The diversion of these forces from offensive operations in Italy reduced the overall strength available for the conquest of Roman territories and created strategic pressures that influenced Attila's decision-making process. The diplomatic negotiations that ultimately led to Hun withdrawal from Italy involved complex discussions regarding tribute payments, territorial boundaries, and the resolution of outstanding disputes, including the Honoria controversy. The specific terms of these agreements, while not fully preserved in contemporary sources, appear to have included substantial payments of gold and other valuable goods that provided Attila with compensation for ending his Italian campaign. These arrangements, while allowing the Western Roman Empire to avoid complete destruction, established precedents for future Hun-Roman relations that would influence imperial policy for generations to come. The withdrawal from Italy marked the final major military campaign of Attila's reign, but the Hun king's political ambitions remained undiminished despite the logistical and strategic challenges that had forced his retreat from the peninsula. The tribute payments and territorial concessions extracted through negotiations with Pope Leo I had provided substantial compensation for the abbreviated Italian campaign, yet Attila's court continued to pursue diplomatic initiatives designed to expand Hun influence throughout Europe. The most significant of these diplomatic maneuvers involved renewed marriage negotiations that would ultimately lead to the circumstances surrounding the Hun king's mysterious death. The diplomatic landscape of 453 CE presented Attila with numerous opportunities to expand Hun territorial control through strategic marriage alliances rather than costly military campaigns. The death of Theodoric I at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains had created succession disputes within the Visigothic kingdom that offered possibilities for Hun intervention. Similarly, the ongoing instability within the Western Roman Empire, exacerbated by the unresolved Honoria controversy and the financial strain of defending against Hun attacks, provided opportunities for political manipulation that could achieve territorial gains without the enormous costs associated with military conquest. The marriage negotiations that occupied much of Attila's attention during the final months of his reign involved a complex web of diplomatic relationships designed to secure Hun influence over key Germanic tribes while simultaneously pressuring the Roman Empire through the threat of expanded barbarian coalitions. The most significant of these negotiations concerned a proposed alliance with the Burgundian kingdom, which controlled strategic territories along the Rhine frontier that could serve as launching points for future attacks against Gaul. The Burgundian king, Gundioch, had expressed interest in marriage alliances that would provide his kingdom with Hun protection against Frankish expansion while offering Attila access to the wealthy Rhine Valley. The specific marriage proposal that would prove fatal to Attila involved Ildiko, a young Germanic noblewoman whose exact tribal affiliation remains disputed among contemporary sources. Some accounts describe her as a member of the Burgundian royal family, while others suggest she belonged to one of the smaller Germanic tribes that had recently submitted to Hun authority. The political significance of this marriage extended beyond simple diplomatic alliance to encompass broader strategic objectives related to Hun control over Germanic populations and the consolidation of territorial gains achieved through previous military campaigns. Ildiko's background, while obscured by conflicting historical accounts, appears to have included connections to multiple Germanic tribal groups that made her an attractive candidate for marriage alliance. From Attila's perspective, her family relationships provided potential diplomatic leverage over several tribal confederations, while her youth and reported beauty satisfied the personal preferences that influenced Attila's marriage decisions. The negotiations surrounding this marriage alliance involved complex discussions regarding dowry arrangements, territorial concessions, and military cooperation agreements that would have significantly expanded Hun influence over Germanic territories. The wedding ceremony that took place in the spring of 453 CE reflected the elaborate court rituals that had developed within the Hun Confederation during Attila's reign. The celebration, held at Attila's primary residence in the Carpathian Basin, brought together representatives from dozens of tribal groups and diplomatic missions from various European kingdoms. The scale and magnificence of the festivities demonstrated the wealth and power that Hun military success had accumulated, while the diverse attendance illustrated the extent of Attila's political influence throughout the barbarian world. Contemporary accounts of the wedding celebration describe elaborate feasts featuring exotic foods and beverages imported from across the known world, entertainment provided by musicians and performers drawn from multiple cultural traditions, and the display of treasure hoards that represented the accumulated wealth of decades of successful military campaigns. The Hun nobility, dressed in silk garments and jewellery acquired through trade with distant lands, demonstrated the sophisticated material culture that had developed within the nomadic confederation. Germanic guests, while maintaining their traditional appearance and customs, participated in ceremonies that blended Hun and Germanic traditions in ways that reflected the complex cultural synthesis occurring within Attila's empire. The wedding night of April 453 CE began with the customary rituals and celebrations that characterized Hun marriage ceremonies, but the events that followed would fundamentally alter the course of European history. Attila retired to his private chambers with his new bride following the conclusion of the public festivities, accompanied by the traditional escort of bodyguards and court officials who maintained security around the royal residence. The specific details of what occurred during the night remain the subject of historical debate, as the only witnesses to the actual events were either dead or had compelling reasons to conceal the truth. The discovery of Attila's body on the morning following his wedding night created immediate crisis within the Hun Confederation and raised questions about the circumstances of his death that have never been definitively resolved. The king was found lying in a pool of blood, with evidence suggesting that he'd suffered a severe nosebleed during the night. Ildiko, discovered in a state of terror and confusion, provided conflicting accounts of the night's events that failed to clarify whether Attila's death resulted from natural causes, accident, or deliberate action. The absence of obvious wounds or signs of violence complicated efforts to determine the exact cause of death. The medical evidence available to contemporary observers suggested several possible explanations for Attila's sudden death, each of which carried different implications for the political stability of the Hun Confederation. The severe nosebleed that had apparently caused his death could have resulted from natural causes, including high blood pressure exacerbated by the stress of recent military campaigns and the excessive consumption of alcohol during the wedding celebration. Alternatively, the bleeding could have been caused by deliberate poisoning, either administered by Ildiko herself or by other conspirators who had access to the royal chambers. The possibility of assassination remained a persistent concern among Hun nobles and tribal leaders who recognized the political implications of Attila's death for the future of their confederation. The timing of the death, occurring on the wedding night with a Germanic bride whose tribal affiliations remained somewhat unclear, raised suspicions about potential Germanic involvement in a conspiracy designed to eliminate the greatest threat to their independence. The lack of obvious wounds or signs of struggle, however, made it difficult to establish conclusive evidence of foul play. The immediate aftermath of Attila's death revealed the fundamental weaknesses in the Hun political system that had been concealed by the king's personal authority and military success. The Confederation's governmental structure, while sophisticated in its ability to coordinate military campaigns and manage tribute collection, lacked the institutional mechanisms necessary for smooth succession transitions. The absence of clearly established succession laws created opportunities for competing claimants to advance their own interests, while potentially destabilizing the entire confederation. The three sons of Attila, who emerged as primary claimants to their father's authority, each possessed different strengths and weaknesses that would influence their ability to maintain Hun unity. Elek, the eldest son, had served as his father's primary military lieutenant during recent campaigns, and possessed extensive experience in battlefield command and strategic planning. His supporters argued that his military expertise and proven leadership capabilities made him the natural successor to Attila's authority. However, his aggressive temperament and tendency toward harsh treatment of subject peoples had created enemies among some tribal groups who feared his rule would lead to increased oppression. Dengizic, the second son, had focused his career on diplomatic and administrative responsibilities within the Hun Confederation, developing expertise in tribute collection, treaty negotiations, and the management of relationships with subject peoples. His supporters emphasized his political skills and his ability to maintain the complex web of alliances that held the Confederation together. Critics, however, questioned his military capabilities and his ability to command respect from the warrior culture that dominated Hun society. His more moderate approach to governance appealed to some tribal groups, but was viewed with suspicion by others who preferred the aggressive leadership style that had characterized Attila's reign. Ernak, the youngest of the three brothers, had spent much of his career managing the eastern territories of the Hun Confederation and had developed strong relationships with the traditional nomadic tribes that formed the core of Hun military power. His supporters argued that his deep understanding of steppe culture and his connections to the original Hun heartlands made him the most legitimate heir to his father's authority. However, his limited experience in dealing with Germanic and Roman populations raised questions about his ability to manage the diverse ethnic groups that comprised the Confederation. The succession crisis that developed following Attila's death reflected not only personal rivalries between his sons, but also deeper tensions within the Hun Confederation regarding the future direction of their political development. The rapid expansion of Hun territorial control during Attila's reign had created a diverse empire that included traditional nomadic populations, recently conquered Germanic tribes, and various other ethnic groups with different cultural traditions and political expectations. The challenge of maintaining unity among these diverse populations required leadership skills that extended beyond simple military prowess to encompass diplomatic sophistication and administrative competence. The initial attempts by Attila's sons to resolve the succession crisis through negotiation and compromise revealed the extent to which personal ambitions had begun to override considerations of Confederation unity. Each brother sought to maximize his own territorial control and political authority, while minimizing the influence of his siblings, creating a competitive dynamic that undermined efforts to maintain coordinated leadership. The tribal groups that had submitted to Hun authority during Attila's reign found themselves forced to choose between competing claimants, creating divisions that would prove difficult to heal. The fragmentation of Hun unity became apparent within months of Attila's death as different tribal groups began to assert their independence from central authority. The Germanic tribes that had been incorporated into the Hun Confederation through conquest rather than voluntary submission saw the succession crisis as an opportunity to regain their autonomy. The absence of Attila's personal authority, which had been the primary factor maintaining their loyalty, removed the main constraint preventing their rebellion against Hun rule. The Gepids, under their king Ardaric, emerged as the leaders of the Germanic rebellion against continued Hun domination. The Gepid kingdom, located in the Carpathian Basin adjacent to the traditional Hun heartlands, had maintained its internal political structure despite nominal submission to Attila's authority. Ardaric, who had served as one of Attila's primary military commanders during the Italian campaign, possessed intimate knowledge of Hun military capabilities and strategic weaknesses that would prove crucial in organizing effective resistance. his decision to rebel against Hun authority was influenced by his recognition that the succession crisis had created a window of opportunity that might not occur again. The Ostrogoths, led by members of the Amal dynasty who had survived the initial Hun conquest of their territories, joined the Gepid rebellion as they sought to re-establish their independence and reclaim their traditional lands. The Ostrogothic contribution to the rebellion included substantial military forces and political leadership that helped coordinate resistance activities across multiple tribal groups. Their participation in the rebellion represented a rejection of the client status that had characterized their relationship with the Hun Confederation since their initial submission decades earlier. The Rugians, Heralds, and other smaller Germanic tribes that had been incorporated into the Hun Confederation also joined the rebellion, contributing their military forces to the growing coalition opposed to continued Hun rule. These tribes, while individually less powerful than the Gepids or Ostrogoths, collectively represented significant military capabilities that enhanced the rebellion's prospects for success. Their participation in the rebellion reflected widespread dissatisfaction with Hun rule and the desire to regain the political autonomy that had been lost through conquest. The Battle of Nidau, fought in 454 CE at a location that remains disputed among historians, but was likely situated along the Nidau River in the Carpathian Basin, represented the decisive confrontation between the fragmenting Hun Confederation and the Germanic rebellion. The battle brought together the largest armies that had been assembled in Europe since the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, with forces totaling over 100,000 warriors drawn from dozens of tribal groups. The outcome of this engagement would determine whether the Hun Confederation could maintain its territorial integrity, or whether the Germanic rebellion would succeed in dismantling the nomadic empire that Attila had constructed. The Hun forces that participated in the Battle of Nidau were commanded by Elac, who had emerged as the dominant figure among Attila's sons during the months following their father's death. His army included the traditional Hun cavalry that had formed the core of Attila's military power, supplemented by tribal groups that had remained loyal to the Confederation despite the succession crisis. The total strength of Hun forces was estimated at approximately 40,000 warriors, significantly smaller than the armies that Attila had commanded during his major campaigns, but still representing formidable military capabilities. The Germanic coalition that opposed the Hun forces was led by Ardaric of the Gepids, who had assumed overall command of the rebellion through his military expertise and political skills. The coalition army included substantial contingents from the Gepids, Ostrogoths, Rugians, and other tribal groups that had joined the rebellion, totaling approximately 60,000 warriors. The diverse composition of this army created coordination challenges, but the shared objective of eliminating Hun domination provided sufficient motivation to overcome these difficulties. The battle began with traditional Hun cavalry charges designed to disrupt Germanic formations and create opportunities for the devastating archery attacks that had proven so effective in previous campaigns. However, the Germanic forces had learned from their previous encounters with Hun tactics and had developed countermeasures that reduced the effectiveness of nomadic warfare. The use of dense infantry formations protected by large shields limited the impact of Hun archery, while coordinated cavalry charges by Germanic heavy cavalry neutralised the mobility advantages that had traditionally favoured nomadic forces. The death of Elac during the battle's climactic phase eliminated the most militarily capable of Attila's sons and effectively ended Hun hopes of maintaining their territorial empire. Elac's death, occurring while he led a desperate cavalry charge against Gepid positions, deprived the Hun forces of their primary military leader and created panic among warriors who had depended on his tactical expertise. The collapse of Hun resistance following Elac's death demonstrated the extent to which the Confederation's military effectiveness had depended on individual leadership rather than institutional structures. The immediate consequences of the Battle of Nidau extended far beyond the military defeat of Hun forces to encompass the complete dissolution of the territorial empire that Attila had constructed. The Germanic tribes that had participated in the rebellion immediately began to assert control over their traditional territories, while the surviving Hun populations retreated toward their original heartlands in the eastern steppes. The rapid collapse of Hun political authority created a power vacuum in Central Europe that would influence the development of medieval European civilization for centuries to come. The geopolitical implications of Hun fragmentation for the Roman Empire were complex and multifaceted, creating both opportunities and challenges for imperial policymakers. The elimination of the Hun threat removed the most serious military pressure that had faced both the Eastern and Western Roman empires during the 5th century, allowing imperial resources to be redirected toward other strategic priorities. However, the collapse of Hun authority also created instability throughout the barbarian world that would generate new challenges for Roman frontier security and diplomatic relationships. The Eastern Roman Empire, under Emperor Marcian, was the first to recognize the strategic opportunities created by Hun fragmentation. The cessation of tribute payments that had drained imperial resources for decades provided immediate financial relief that could be used to strengthen military forces and rebuild defensive fortifications. The elimination of the Hun threat also allowed the Eastern Empire to pursue more aggressive policies toward other barbarian groups and to reassert imperial authority over territories that had been lost or threatened during the period of Hun dominance. The Western Roman Empire, while also benefiting from the elimination of the Hun threat, faced more complex challenges in managing the aftermath of the Confederation's collapse. The Germanic tribes that had gained independence through the rebellion against Hun authority now controlled substantial territories that had previously been under nomadic rule. These newly independent kingdoms represented potential threats to Roman interests, but they also offered opportunities for diplomatic alliances that could strengthen imperial security. The challenge for Western Roman policymakers was to navigate these complex relationships while avoiding the creation of new barbarian coalitions that could threaten imperial territories. The catastrophic defeat at Nidau had shattered the Hun Confederation's territorial integrity, but the surviving nomadic populations did not simply vanish into historical obscurity. Instead, they regrouped under the leadership of Attila's remaining sons, establishing separate kingdoms that would continue to pose significant challenges to Roman authority for another generation. The fragmentation of Hun power created a complex political landscape across the Carpathian Basin and the Pontic steppes, where competing nomadic factions struggled to maintain control over diminished territories while facing persistent pressure from resurgent Germanic tribes and opportunistic Roman military operations. Dengitzik, having survived the political upheaval following his brother Elak's death, emerged as the most prominent leader among the Hun remnants. His territorial base centered on the eastern portions of the former Confederation, encompassing the traditional grazing lands along the lower Danube and extending into the Pontic steppes, where Hun populations had maintained their strongest cultural connections to nomadic traditions. The kingdom that developed under his leadership represented a conscious attempt to preserve Hun political identity, while adapting to the reduced circumstances created by the Confederation's collapse. Archaeological evidence from settlements in this region reveals the continuation of distinctive Hun material culture, including the characteristic bronze cauldrons and horse gear that had marked nomadic presence throughout their expansion period. The administrative structure of Dengisic's kingdom reflected both the constraints imposed by territorial losses and the necessity of maintaining military effectiveness with reduced resources. The traditional decimal organization of Hun military units was modified to accommodate smaller population bases, with tribal groups reorganized into more compact formations that could respond quickly to threats from multiple directions. The kingdom's military capabilities, while significantly reduced from the massive armies that Attila had commanded, still included substantial cavalry forces equipped with composite bows and trained in the horse archery techniques that had proven so effective against sedentary opponents. Ernak, the youngest of Attila's sons, established his authority over Hun populations that had retreated toward the traditional heartlands in the eastern steppes. His kingdom, centered in the region between the Dnieper and Don rivers, represented a return to the nomadic lifestyle that had characterized Hun society before their westward expansion. The archaeological record from this period shows a marked simplification in material culture, with settlements displaying fewer luxury goods and foreign imports compared to the elaborate court culture that had developed during Attila's reign. This transformation reflected both the economic constraints imposed by territorial losses and a deliberate cultural reorientation toward traditional steppe values. The relationship between the two Hun successor kingdoms involved complex negotiations regarding territorial boundaries, military cooperation, and the division of remaining tribal populations. Contemporary Byzantine sources describe diplomatic exchanges between Dengizic and Ernak that attempted to coordinate their responses to external threats while avoiding direct conflict between their followers. These negotiations reveal the persistent tensions within Hun society regarding the appropriate response to their reduced circumstances, with some tribal groups advocating for aggressive attempts to reclaim lost territories, while others preferred defensive strategies focused on preserving their remaining autonomy. The Germanic tribes that had gained independence through the rebellion at Nadau moved quickly to consolidate their territorial gains and established new political structures that would prevent any future Hun resurgence. The Gepids, under Arderic's continued leadership, claimed extensive territories in the Carpathian Basin that had previously formed the core of Hun power. Their kingdom, stretching from the Tisa River to the Carpathian Mountains, controlled crucial agricultural lands and strategic river crossings that provided both economic resources and defensive advantages. The Gepid military, strengthened by their victory over the Huns, included substantial infantry forces equipped with captured Roman weapons and siege equipment that enhanced their ability to defend fortified positions. The Ostrogoths, led by members of the Amal dynasty who had survived decades of Hun domination, reclaimed their traditional territories in the region between the Dniester and Dnieper rivers. Their kingdom represented a restoration of Gothic political authority that had been interrupted by the initial Hun conquest, but the intervening period of nomadic rule had significantly altered Ostrogothic society. The integration of Hun military techniques, particularly horse archery and cavalry tactics, had created a hybrid military culture that combined Germanic infantry traditions with nomadic mobility. This synthesis would prove crucial in the Ostrogoths' subsequent expansion into Roman territories and their eventual establishment of the Italian kingdom under Theodoric the Great. The Rugians, Herulds, and other smaller Germanic tribes that had participated in the rebellion established their own territorial kingdoms throughout the former Hun Empire. These smaller political entities, while individually less powerful than the Gepid or Ostrogothic kingdoms, collectively controlled substantial territories and represented significant military capabilities. Their political development followed patterns similar to those of their larger neighbours, with traditional tribal structures adapting to the requirements of territorial administration while maintaining the military effectiveness necessary for survival in the competitive post-Hun environment. The immediate aftermath of Hun fragmentation created opportunities for Roman diplomatic initiatives designed to prevent the formation of new barbarian coalitions that could threaten imperial territories. The Eastern Roman Empire under Emperor Marcian pursued a policy of selective engagement with the successor kingdoms, offering military support and diplomatic recognition to those groups that demonstrated willingness to serve Roman interests. This approach, while successful in preventing immediate threats to imperial security, also contributed to the militarization of the barbarian world by providing Germanic tribes with access to Roman military technology and training. The Western Roman Empire, facing more immediate challenges from the proximity of Germanic kingdoms to Italian territories, adopted a more cautious approach that emphasized defensive preparations and the strengthening of frontier fortifications. The collapse of Hun power had eliminated the primary external threat to Western Roman security, but it had also created a complex array of smaller threats that required different strategic responses. The fragmentation of barbarian power made traditional diplomatic solutions more difficult, as imperial negotiators now faced dozens of independent tribal leaders rather than a single dominant authority. Dengizic's continued raids against the Eastern Roman Empire represented the most persistent challenge to imperial security during the post-Hun period. His kingdom's location along the lower Danube provided excellent launching points for attacks against Roman territories in Moesia and Thrace, while the mobility of his cavalry forces made it difficult for imperial armies to mount effective defensive responses. The raids that began in 456 CE followed traditional Hun patterns, with rapid cavalry strikes against isolated settlements and supply convoys designed to extract wealth while avoiding direct confrontation with major Roman military forces. The tactical methods employed in these raids demonstrated the continuation of Hun military traditions despite the reduced scale of operations. Dengizic's forces retained their expertise in composite bow construction and horse archery, allowing them to maintain the tactical advantages that had characterized nomadic warfare throughout the expansion period. The raids typically involved forces of several thousand cavalry, organized according to traditional decimal systems and commanded by experienced warriors who had participated in Attila's major campaigns. Their equipment included the characteristic Hun weapons and horse gear, supplemented by captured Roman military supplies that enhanced their operational capabilities. The psychological impact of these continued raids on Roman frontier populations was significant, as the memory of Attila's devastating campaigns remained fresh in the minds of those who had survived the previous conflicts. The appearance of Hun cavalry in Roman territories, even in reduced numbers, created panic among civilian populations who associated nomadic warriors with the systematic destruction that had characterized the campaigns of the 440s and 450s. This psychological warfare component of the raids often proved as effective as their material impact in disrupting Roman administrative and economic activities. The Roman military response to Dengizic's raids revealed both the strengths and limitations of imperial defensive capabilities during the post-Hun period. The Eastern Roman army, while no longer required to maintain the massive tribute payments that had characterized the Attila period, still faced significant challenges encountering nomadic mobility and tactical flexibility. Roman commanders had learned valuable lessons from their previous encounters with Hun forces, developing improved cavalry units and more effective coordination between infantry and mounted forces. However, the fundamental advantages of nomadic warfare in terms of mobility and strategic surprise remained difficult to counter. The fortification programs implemented along the Danubian frontier during this period reflected Roman efforts to create defensive systems that could contain nomadic raids while minimizing the military resources required for frontier security. The construction of new fortress cities and the upgrading of existing defensive positions created a network of strongholds that could provide refuge for civilian populations while serving as bases for Roman military operations. These fortifications, built according to the latest military engineering principles, included sophisticated artillery positions and defensive arrangements designed specifically to counter nomadic siege techniques. The gradual absorption of Hun populations into other tribal confederations represented one of the most significant long-term consequences of the confederation's collapse. Many Hun warriors and their families, finding themselves unable to maintain their traditional nomadic lifestyle in the reduced territories controlled by Dengizic and Ernak, sought integration into the Germanic kingdoms that had emerged from the rebellion at Nidau. This process of cultural assimilation involved complex negotiations regarding the status of Hun refugees and their integration into existing tribal structures. The Gepid kingdom, due to its territorial proximity to traditional Hun heartlands, absorbed the largest number of Hun refugees during the decade following Nidau. The integration process involved careful management of potential conflicts between Hun and Gepid populations, with King Ardaric implementing policies designed to utilize Hun military expertise while preventing the formation of separate nomadic enclaves within his kingdom. Hun cavalry units were incorporated into Gepid military forces, bringing their specialized skills in horse archery and mobile warfare to supplement traditional Germanic infantry capabilities. The Ostrogothic kingdom also absorbed substantial Hun populations, particularly those groups that had been displaced from the territories between the Dniester and Dnieper rivers. The Ostrogothic approach to integration emphasized the preservation of Hun military traditions while requiring political loyalty to Amal dynasty leadership. This policy created hybrid military units that combined Gothic infantry strength with Hun cavalry mobility, producing tactical innovations that would prove crucial in subsequent Ostrogothic campaigns against Roman territories. The service of former Hun warriors as foederati in Roman armies represented another significant aspect of the post-Confederation period. The Roman military, recognizing the value of nomadic military expertise, actively recruited Hun cavalry units for service along various frontier regions. These foederati arrangements provided Hun warriors with opportunities to maintain their traditional military lifestyle while serving Roman strategic interests. The integration of Hun cavalry into Roman military forces brought significant tactical advantages, particularly in campaigns against other nomadic groups and in frontier security operations. The foederati contracts negotiated between Roman commanders and Hun military leaders typically included provisions for the settlement of warrior families in designated territories, the payment of regular subsidies for military service, and the recognition of traditional Hun military organization within Roman command structures. These arrangements allowed Hun units to maintain their cultural identity while serving imperial strategic objectives, creating a model for barbarian integration that would influence Roman military policy throughout the late imperial period. The archaeological evidence for Hun presence in the Carpathian Basin during this transitional period reveals the gradual transformation of nomadic material culture as surviving populations adapted to changed circumstances. Excavations at sites throughout the region show a marked decline in the luxury goods and foreign imports that had characterized Hun settlements during Attila's reign, replaced by more utilitarian objects that reflected the economic constraints imposed by territorial losses. The continuation of traditional burial practices, including the deposition of horse gear and weapons in graves, demonstrates the persistence of Hun cultural identity despite political fragmentation. The metalworking traditions that had developed within Hun society during their expansion period continue to influence craftsmen throughout the former Confederation territories. The distinctive belt fittings, horse gear and weapons associated with Hun material culture appear in archaeological contexts throughout the Carpathian Basin well into the 460 SCE, indicating the continued presence of nomadic populations and their integration into local economies. The technical knowledge required for composite bow construction and specialized metalworking techniques was transmitted to Germanic craftsmen, contributing to the development of hybrid technologies that combined nomadic and sedentary traditions. The settlement patterns revealed through archaeological survey demonstrate the adaptation of Hun populations to more sedentary lifestyles as their traditional nomadic territories became untenable. Sites dating to the post-Nidau period show evidence of more permanent structures and agricultural activities, indicating that some Hun groups had begun to adopt farming practices to supplement their traditional pastoral economy. This transition, while representing a fundamental change in lifestyle, allowed Hun populations to maintain their presence in regions where purely nomadic existence had become impossible. The pottery traditions associated with Hun settlements during this period show increasing influence from Germanic and Roman ceramic styles, reflecting the cultural exchange that occurred as nomadic populations integrated with sedentary neighbours. The functional characteristics of Hun pottery, emphasising portability and durability, continued to influence vessel design throughout the region, while decorative elements increasingly incorporated motifs from other cultural traditions. This ceramic evidence provides valuable insights into the process of cultural synthesis that characterised the post-Hun period. The horse breeding practices that had been central to Hun military effectiveness continued to influence the development of cavalry forces throughout the former Confederation territories. The selective breeding programs that had produced the hardy steppe horses essential for nomadic warfare were maintained by Germanic kingdoms that recognized the military value of superior horse stock. Archaeological evidence from horse burials during this period shows the continuation of careful attention to equine genetics and the preservation of bloodlines that had been developed during the Hun expansion period. The gradual decline of Hun political authority during the 460 SCE resulted from a combination of military pressure, internal divisions, and the successful adaptation of their former subjects to independence. Dengizish's kingdom, despite its continued military activities, faced increasing challenges from coordinated Roman and Germanic responses to nomadic raids. The kingdom's territorial base was gradually eroded through military defeats and the defection of tribal groups that found better opportunities in service to other powers. The reduction in available grazing lands and the disruption of traditional migration routes further weakened the kingdom's ability to maintain its nomadic lifestyle. The final defeat and death of Dengizich in 469 CE marked the end of organised Hun resistance to the post-Nadao political order. His death, occurring during a failed raid against Roman territories in Thrace, eliminated the last significant Hun leader capable of coordinating nomadic military activities on a scale that threatened regional stability. The circumstances of his defeat, involving coordinated Roman and Germanic forces that had learned to counter nomadic tactics effectively, demonstrated the extent to which the military balance had shifted since the collapse of Attila's confederation. The heads of Dengizich and his primary lieutenants were displayed in Constantinople as trophies of Roman victory, providing symbolic closure to the Hun threat that had dominated Eastern Roman policy for decades. The public exhibition of these gruesome trophies served both to demonstrate imperial military success and to reassure populations that had lived under the shadow of nomadic invasion for a generation. The elimination of Hun leadership created opportunities for the final integration of remaining nomadic populations into the emerging political structures of medieval Europe. The dispersal of remaining Hun populations following Dengizich's death in 469 CE marked the end of organised nomadic resistance, but the cultural and political transformations initiated by nearly a century of Hun dominance had fundamentally altered the trajectory of European civilization. The immediate disappearance of Hun political authority obscured the profound and lasting changes that their presence had wrought across the continent, changes that would continue to influence European development for centuries to come. The Hun invasions had triggered a cascade of demographic, political, and cultural transformations that reshaped the very foundations of post-Roman Europe, creating new political entities, military traditions, and cultural syntheses that would define the medieval period. The transformation of European political geography through Hun-induced migrations represented perhaps the most immediate and visible consequence of nomadic expansion. The initial Hun crossing of the Volga in the 350 SCE had set in motion a demographic upheaval that displaced entire populations across thousands of miles, fundamentally altering the ethnic composition of regions from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean. The Gothic migrations that followed Hun expansion had not merely relocated existing tribal groups but had created entirely new political configurations as displaced populations merged with local inhabitants or established dominance over previously settled territories. The Visigothic kingdom in southwestern Gaul and Iberia, the Ostrogothic presence in the Balkans and later Italy, and the various Germanic settlements throughout the Western Roman Empire all represented direct consequences of the demographic pressures created by Hun expansion. The collapse of existing tribal structures under Hun pressure had eliminated political entities that had dominated European barbarian society for centuries. The destruction of the Greuthungi Confederation under Ermanaric, and the fragmentation of the Tervingi under Athanaric had removed the most powerful Gothic political organisations, while the conquest of the Alan confederations had eliminated the dominant Sarmatian presence in the Pontic steppes. These political destructions created power vacuums that were filled by new configurations of tribal authority, often based on military effectiveness rather than traditional hereditary claims. The emergence of war leaders like Alaric among the Visigoths and the rise of the Amal dynasty among the Ostrogoths reflected the militarization of barbarian society that resulted from the constant warfare of the Hun period. The settlement patterns that emerged from these demographic upheavals created a new political geography that would persist throughout the medieval period. The establishment of Germanic kingdoms within former Roman territories fundamentally altered the balance between imperial authority and barbarian independence. The Burgundian kingdom along the Rhine, the Vandal presence in North Africa, and the Anglo-Saxon settlements in Britain all represented political entities that had been made possible by the demographic disruptions initiated by Hun expansion. These kingdoms, while maintaining their Germanic cultural identities, incorporated administrative and military innovations that had been developed during the period of nomadic dominance. The urban transformations that resulted from Hun military pressure created lasting changes in European settlement patterns and defensive architecture. The systematic destruction of cities like Aquileia, Metz, and numerous Balkan urban centres had eliminated established commercial and administrative networks, forcing surviving populations to develop new forms of economic and political organisation. The refugee settlements in the Venetian lagoon that would eventually develop into Venice represented the most dramatic example of this urban transformation, but similar processes occurred throughout regions that had experienced direct Hun assault. The development of hill-fort settlements and the fortification of previously undefended communities reflected the militarization of civilian life that characterized the post-Hun period. The influence of Hun military innovations on medieval European warfare extended far beyond the immediate tactical advantages that had made nomadic armies so formidable. The systematic adoption of composite bow technology by Germanic and Roman forces represented a fundamental shift in European military capabilities. The construction techniques for these sophisticated weapons, requiring specialized knowledge of materials and manufacturing processes, had been transmitted to sedentary populations through the integration of Hun craftsmen and warriors into Germanic kingdoms and Roman military units. Archaeological evidence from weapon-producing centres throughout the former Hun territories reveals the continuation of nomadic metalworking traditions well into the 6th century CE, indicating the persistence of technical knowledge that had been developed during the expansion period. The cavalry tactics that had given Hun armies their decisive advantages became standard components of medieval European warfare through the integration of nomadic military traditions with Germanic and Roman fighting methods. The development of heavy cavalry formations that would dominate medieval battlefields drew directly from the tactical innovations that had been pioneered during the Hun period. The emphasis on mounted warfare, the coordination of cavalry and infantry units, and the systematic use of archery from horseback all reflected the influence of nomadic military doctrine on European tactical development. The stirrup technology that had provided Hun cavalry with superior stability and leverage spread throughout Europe during the 5th and 6th centuries, fundamentally altering the effectiveness of mounted combat. The siege warfare techniques that Hun armies had developed through their integration of Roman engineering knowledge with nomadic mobility created new approaches to urban warfare that influenced medieval military architecture. The portable siege equipment and rapid deployment methods that had enabled nomadic forces to capture fortified cities demonstrated the vulnerability of traditional defensive systems to innovative assault techniques. The response to these tactical innovations involved the development of new fortification designs that incorporated lessons learned from Hun siege operations. The concentric castle designs that would characterize medieval defensive architecture reflected the need to counter the multi-layered assault methods that had been pioneered during the Hun expansion period. The military organization systems that had enabled the Hun Confederation to coordinate diverse tribal groups across vast territories provided models for the administrative structures of medieval kingdoms, the decimal organization of military units, the integration of different ethnic groups within unified command structures, and the systematic use of tributary relationships all influenced the development of medieval governmental institutions. The feudal relationships that would characterize medieval European society drew upon organizational principles that had been developed during the Hun period, including the systematic exchange of military service for territorial control and the hierarchical structures that bound different social groups together through mutual obligations. The development of Hun historical mythology and medieval chronicles and epic literature created cultural narratives that would influence European identity formation for centuries. The figure of Attila as the Scourge of God became a central element in Christian historical interpretation, representing divine punishment for human sinfulness while simultaneously embodying the barbarian threat to Christian civilization. The incorporation of Hun historical narratives into medieval chronicles provided explanatory frameworks for understanding the collapse of Roman authority and the emergence of Germanic kingdoms. The Nibelungenlied and other epic traditions that developed during the medieval period drew upon historical memories of the Hun period, transforming political and military events into cultural myths that reinforce social values and political identities. The chroniclers who recorded Hun history during the medieval period approached their subject matter with complex motivations that combined historical preservation with contemporary political concerns. The Byzantine historians who maintained the most detailed records of Hun activities viewed nomadic expansion through the lens of imperial survival and Christian providence, creating narratives that emphasized both the destructive power of barbarian invasion and the ultimate triumph of Christian civilization. The Germanic chroniclers who recorded tribal traditions related to the Hun period focused on themes of heroic resistance and cultural preservation, creating literary traditions that celebrated the military virtues that had enabled their ancestors to survive nomadic domination. The transformation of historical figures like Attila into legendary characters reflected the cultural processing of traumatic historical experiences through mythological frameworks. The evolution of Attila from a historical military leader into a figure of supernatural power and divine judgment demonstrated the ways in which medieval societies incorporated historical memories into their religious and cultural worldviews. The various national traditions that claimed descent from or victory over the Huns created foundation myths that legitimized medieval political authority while providing cultural continuity with the pre-Christian past. The archaeological discoveries that have contributed to modern understanding of Hun material culture reveal the sophisticated technological and artistic traditions that developed within nomadic society during the expansion period. The excavations at Hun burial sites throughout the Carpathian Basin and the Pontic Steppes have uncovered evidence of complex social hierarchies, extensive trade networks, and technological innovations that challenge traditional assumptions about nomadic capabilities. The elaborate grave goods found in elite Hun burials, including silk textiles from China, Roman glass vessels, and locally produced metalwork of exceptional quality, demonstrate the wealth and cultural sophistication that characterized Hun society at its height. The bronze cauldrons that represent the most distinctive artifacts of Hun material culture reveal the technological expertise and cultural continuity that connected nomadic populations across vast geographical distances. The distribution of these vessels, found in contexts ranging from the Mongolian steppes to the Carpathian Basin, provides evidence of the migration routes and cultural connections that linked Hun populations throughout their expansion period. The manufacturing techniques required for the production of these large, complex vessels demonstrate the sophisticated metalworking capabilities that existed within nomadic society, while their ceremonial functions reveal the religious and social practices that maintained cultural identity across diverse geographical and political contexts. The horse gear and weapons found in Hun archaeological contexts provide detailed evidence of the technological innovations that made nomadic military superiority possible. The composite bows recovered from burial sites retain sufficient preservation to allow detailed analysis of their construction techniques, revealing the sophisticated understanding of material science that enabled nomadic craftsmen to create weapons of exceptional power and accuracy. The iron stirrups, bridle bits and saddle components found in Hun graves demonstrate the technological advances in horse management that provided the foundation for nomadic military effectiveness. The social organization revealed through archaeological analysis of Hun settlements and burial practices demonstrates the complex hierarchical structures that govern nomadic society during the expansion period. The variation in grave goods between different burial sites indicates the existence of distinct social classes within Hun society, ranging from elite nobles buried with elaborate weapons and luxury goods to common warriors interred with basic military equipment. The presence of non-Hun individuals in elite burial contexts suggests the integration of conquered populations into nomadic social structures, while the continuation of traditional burial practices indicates the preservation of cultural identity despite political and territorial changes. The daily life of Hun populations, as revealed through archaeological evidence, involved a complex combination of traditional nomadic practices and adaptations to the diverse environments encountered during their expansion. The pottery assemblages found at Hun sites demonstrate the continuation of traditional ceramic traditions, alongside the adoption of new vessel forms that reflected contact with sedentary populations. The food remains recovered from Hun settlements indicate dietary practices that combine traditional pastoral products with agricultural goods obtained through trade or tribute relationships. The tool assemblages found at nomadic sites reveal the technological adaptations necessary for maintaining traditional lifestyles, while operating in unfamiliar geographical and climatic conditions. The religious and spiritual practices of Hun society, while poorly documented in historical sources, can be partially reconstructed through archaeological evidence and comparative analysis with other nomadic traditions. The burial practices that involve the sacrifice of horses and the deposition of specific grave goods suggest beliefs about the afterlife that required material provisions for the deceased. The presence of shamanic artifacts, including drums and ritual objects, in some burial contexts, indicates the continuation of traditional steppe religious practices despite contact with Christian and other religious traditions. The adaptation of religious practices to accommodate the diverse spiritual traditions of conquered populations demonstrates the flexibility of nomadic cultural systems. The economic systems that supported Hun expansion involved complex networks of tribute collection, trade relationships, and resource extraction that connected nomadic populations with sedentary economies throughout Europe and Asia. The archaeological evidence for luxury goods in Hun contexts demonstrates the wealth that was accumulated through military success and political dominance. The presence of Roman gold coins, Chinese silk textiles, and Persian silver vessels in Hun burials indicates the extensive trade networks that connected nomadic society with the major commercial systems of the ancient world. The systematic extraction of tribute from conquered populations provided the economic foundation for the maintenance of large military forces and the support of elaborate court cultures. The technological innovations that emerged from the interaction between nomadic and sedentary populations during the Hun expansion period created new approaches to metallurgy, textile production, and craftsmanship that would influence European material culture for centuries. The integration of Roman engineering techniques with nomadic mobility requirements produced innovations in siege warfare and military engineering that enhanced the effectiveness of both nomadic and sedentary armies. The combination of Germanic metalworking traditions with Hun decorative styles created new artistic traditions that would influence the development of early medieval art and craftsmanship. The linguistic influences that resulted from Hun expansion and the integration of nomadic populations with Germanic and Roman societies created new vocabularies and communication systems that reflected the cultural synthesis of the post-Roman period. The adoption of Hun military terminology by Germanic languages, the integration of nomadic administrative concepts into Latin legal traditions, and the development of new diplomatic vocabularies all demonstrate the linguistic consequences of cultural contact during the expansion period. The preservation of Hun personal names and tribal designations in medieval sources indicates the persistence of nomadic cultural identity despite political fragmentation and territorial displacement. The environmental impacts of Hun expansion, while difficult to quantify through archaeological evidence, likely included significant changes in land use patterns, agricultural practices, and settlement distributions throughout the regions affected by nomadic migration. The large-scale movement of human and animal populations across traditional territorial boundaries created new pressures on local ecosystems and required adaptations in resource management strategies. The integration of nomadic pastoral practices with sedentary agricultural systems created hybrid economic approaches that would influence European rural development throughout the medieval period. The medical and demographic consequences of Hun expansion involved not only the direct casualties of military campaigns, but also the disease transmission and population displacement that accompanied large-scale migration. The archaeological evidence for increased mortality rates during the Hun period, combined with historical accounts of plague and famine, suggests that nomadic expansion created demographic crises that affected both nomadic and sedentary populations. The integration of diverse populations through conquest and migration created new disease environments that required biological and cultural adaptations by all affected groups. The execution of Dengisic in 469 CE and the subsequent display of his severed head in Constantinople marked more than just the death of another barbarian leader. It represented the symbolic end of Hun political identity as an independent force in European affairs. Yet the scattered remnants of Attila's once mighty confederation did not simply vanish overnight. Across the Carpathian Basin, the Pontic Steppes, and the territories that had once acknowledged Hun supremacy, thousands of nomadic families continued to exist in increasingly fragmented communities. These surviving populations faced the fundamental challenge of maintaining their cultural identity while adapting to a European political landscape that had been permanently transformed by their own earlier dominance. The fate of these remaining Hun populations varied dramatically depending on their geographical location and the political circumstances of their immediate neighbours. In the eastern regions, where Ernak had maintained his diminished kingdom until his death around 475 CE, Hun communities gradually merged with the emerging Bulgarian confederations that were beginning to establish themselves along the lower Danube. The Bulgars, themselves a Turkic nomadic people with cultural traditions similar to those of the Huns, provided a natural avenue for the absorption of Hun populations who wished to maintain their pastoral lifestyle. Archaeological evidence from burial sites in this region shows the gradual adoption of Bulgar material culture by populations that had previously followed Hun traditions, indicating a process of cultural assimilation that preserved many nomadic practices while adapting to new political realities. The Hun populations that remained in the Carpathian Basin faced more complex challenges as they found themselves surrounded by Germanic kingdoms that had little interest in accommodating nomadic lifestyles. The Gepid kingdom under Ardaric's successors pursued policies that encouraged the sedentarization of Hun communities, offering land grants and agricultural support to nomadic families willing to abandon their traditional pastoral practices. The transformation of these communities from nomadic herders to settled farmers represented a fundamental cultural shift that was documented in contemporary sources through changes in burial practices, settlement patterns, and material culture. Excavations at sites throughout the Carpathian Basin reveal the gradual disappearance of characteristic Hun artifacts, replaced by pottery styles and tool assemblages that reflected agricultural rather than pastoral lifestyles. The Ostrogothic kingdom, which had expanded its territorial control throughout much of the former Hun heartland, adopted a more systematic approach to the integration of nomadic populations. Under the leadership of Theodoric the Great, who would later establish the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, Hun warriors were actively recruited into Gothic military units, where their expertise in cavalry tactics and archery provided valuable capabilities for the kingdom's expansion. This military integration allowed Hun populations to maintain aspects of their warrior culture while serving new political masters. The Gothic military organisation that emerged during this period incorporated Hun tactical innovations, creating hybrid formations that combined Germanic infantry strength with nomadic cavalry mobility. The process of cultural assimilation that characterised the final decades of the 5th century involved complex negotiations between Hun communities and their new neighbours regarding the preservation of traditional practices within changed political circumstances. Marriage alliances between Hun nobles and Germanic aristocrats created kinship networks that facilitated the integration of nomadic populations into sedentary societies. These intermarriages, while ensuring the survival of Hun bloodlines, also accelerated the process of cultural transformation, as subsequent generations adopted the languages, customs, and religious practices of their dominant neighbours. The archaeological record from this period shows the gradual disappearance of distinctively Hun material culture, replaced by hybrid traditions that combined nomadic and sedentary elements. The role of climate change in accelerating the final dissolution of Hun identity has been increasingly recognised by modern scholars who have analysed paleoclimatic data from the late 5th century. The period between 470 and 500 CE witnessed significant cooling trends across the European steppes, accompanied by increased precipitation that transformed traditional grazing lands into environments less suitable for nomadic pastoralism. The expansion of forested areas into regions that had previously supported extensive grasslands reduced the carrying capacity for the large horse herds that were essential to nomadic military effectiveness. These environmental changes made it increasingly difficult for Hun communities to maintain their traditional lifestyle, forcing them to adopt more sedentary economic practices or migrate to regions where pastoral nomadism remained viable. The cooling climate also affected the migration patterns of other nomadic groups, creating new pressures on the territories where Hun populations had established themselves. The westward movement of Avar confederations during the late 5th century placed additional stress on Hun communities in the Carpathian Basin, while the expansion of Slavic agricultural settlements into the Pontic steppes reduced the available grazing lands for nomadic herders. These demographic pressures created a competitive environment where Hun communities, lacking the military strength and political organisation that had characterised their earlier dominance, found themselves unable to maintain exclusive control over their traditional territories. Political fragmentation among the surviving Hun populations prevented any coordinated response to these environmental and demographic challenges. The absence of unified leadership following the deaths of Attila's sons had eliminated the institutional mechanisms that had previously enabled nomadic communities to coordinate their responses to external threats. The tribal groups that had once formed components of the Hun Confederation now operated as independent entities, each pursuing its own survival strategies without reference to broader nomadic interests. This political fragmentation made Hun communities vulnerable to absorption by more organised neighbouring powers who could offer protection and resources in exchange for military service or political submission. The new migration pressures that emerged during the final decades of the 5th century created additional challenges for surviving Hun populations. The Lombard expansion into the Carpathian Basin displaced existing populations and created new territorial arrangements that left little room for nomadic communities. The Slavic migrations that brought agricultural populations into regions previously dominated by pastoral nomadism fundamentally altered the demographic balance throughout the former Hun territories. These population movements created competitive pressures for land and resources that favoured sedentary agricultural communities over nomadic herders, accelerating the process of Hun cultural dissolution. The systematic analysis of primary sources from this period reveals the complex ways in which contemporary chroniclers understood and recorded the final disappearance of Hun political identity. Priscus of Panium, whose detailed accounts of diplomatic missions to Attila's court provide the most comprehensive contemporary description of Hun society at its height, continued to record information about nomadic activities in the Balkans until his death around 472 CE. His later writings document the gradual fragmentation of Hun political authority and the absorption of nomadic populations into other tribal confederations. The reliability of Priscus's accounts has been confirmed through archaeological evidence and comparative analysis with other contemporary sources, making his chronicles essential for understanding the transition from Hun dominance to post-nomadic political arrangements. Jordanes, writing in the 6th century but drawing upon earlier sources including the lost Gothic history of Cassiodorus, provides valuable information about the integration of Hun populations into Gothic society. His Getica contains detailed descriptions of the ways in which Hun military traditions were incorporated into Gothic warfare, while his account of Gothic-Hun relations during the post-Attila period reveals the complex negotiations that characterised the absorption of nomadic populations into sedentary kingdoms. The historical accuracy of Jordanes' work has been debated by modern scholars, but his accounts generally align with archaeological evidence and other contemporary sources, particularly regarding military and political developments. Gregory of Tours, whose histories of the Franks provide crucial information about political developments in Gaul during the late 5th century, includes references to Hun populations that had settled in Frankish territories following the collapse of the Confederation. His accounts describe the gradual conversion of these populations to Christianity and their integration into Frankish society through military service and agricultural settlement. While Gregory's primary focus was on Frankish political and religious developments, his incidental references to Hun populations provide valuable evidence for the geographic distribution and cultural adaptation of nomadic communities during this period. The reliability of these primary sources must be evaluated within the context of their authors' political and cultural perspectives. Priscus, as a Byzantine diplomat, viewed Hun developments through the lens of imperial security concerns and diplomatic necessity. His accounts emphasize the military and political aspects of Hun society, while providing less detailed information about cultural and social practices. Jordanes, writing as a Gothic historian, focused on the ways in which Hun interactions had influenced Gothic political development, potentially emphasizing aspects of Hun-Gothic relations that supported his broader historical narrative. Gregory of Tours, as a Frankish bishop, approached Hun history from a Christian perspective that emphasized religious conversion and divine providence in historical development. Despite these limitations, the convergence of evidence from multiple sources provides a reliable foundation for understanding the final phase of Hun political existence. The archaeological record confirms many of the developments described in historical sources, while comparative analysis with other nomadic societies provides context for understanding the processes of cultural transformation and political fragmentation that characterize the post-Attila period. The combination of historical, archaeological, and environmental evidence creates a comprehensive picture of the complex factors that contributed to the final dissolution of Hun identity as an independent political force. The historiographical analysis of Hun history reveals the ways in which different cultural traditions have interpreted and preserved memories of nomadic dominance. The Byzantine historical tradition, represented by chroniclers like Priscus and later historians such as Procopius, emphasized the military and diplomatic aspects of Hun-Roman relations, while viewing nomadic expansion as a challenge to Christian civilization. The Germanic historical traditions, preserved in works like the Nibelungenlied and other epic literature, transformed historical memories of Hun dominance into mythological narratives that celebrated heroic resistance and cultural survival. The Christian historical tradition, exemplified by chroniclers like Gregory of Tours, interpreted Hun expansion within providential frameworks that emphasized divine judgment and the ultimate triumph of Christian values. The place of the Huns in the broader context of late antiquity cannot be understood without recognizing their role as catalysts for the transformation of the Roman world into medieval Europe. The Hun expansion had initiated a cascade of demographic, political and cultural changes that fundamentally altered the structure of European civilization. The Germanic kingdoms that emerged from the chaos of the Hun period would provide the foundation for medieval European political development, while the military innovations and administrative practices that had been developed during the nomadic expansion would influence European warfare and governance for centuries to come. The contribution of the Huns to the transformation of the Roman world extended beyond their direct military and political impact to encompass broader cultural and technological influences. The integration of nomadic military techniques with Germanic and Roman traditions created new approaches to warfare that would characterize medieval European combat. The administrative systems that had been developed to coordinate diverse tribal groups within the Hun Confederation provided models for the governmental structures of medieval kingdoms. The cultural synthesis that resulted from the interaction between nomadic and sedentary populations created new artistic and technological traditions that would influence European material culture throughout the medieval period. The demographic impact of Hun expansion had permanently altered the ethnic composition of Europe, creating new population distributions that would persist throughout the medieval period. The Gothic settlements in Italy and Iberia, the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, and the various Germanic kingdoms throughout the former Western Roman Empire all represented direct consequences of the population movements initiated by Hun expansion. The urban transformations that had resulted from Hun military pressure, including the development of new commercial centres and the fortification of previously undefended settlements, created settlement patterns that would influence European urban development for centuries. The technological innovations that had emerged from the interaction between nomadic and sedentary populations during the Hun expansion period continued to influence European development long after the disappearance of Hun political authority. The composite bow technology that had given Hun armies their decisive advantage spread throughout Europe during the post-Hun period, fundamentally altering the effectiveness of medieval archery. The stirrup technology that had provided Hun cavalry with superior stability became standard equipment for European mounted warriors, contributing to the development of heavy cavalry formations that would dominate medieval battlefields. The siege warfare techniques that had enabled Hun armies to capture fortified cities influenced the development of medieval military engineering and defensive architecture. The economic systems that had supported Hun expansion, including the systematic extraction of tribute from conquered populations and the integration of diverse communities into unified political structures, provided models for the fiscal and administrative arrangements of medieval kingdoms. The diplomatic practices that had enabled Hun leaders to coordinate relationships with multiple political entities simultaneously influenced the development of medieval international relations and treaty-making procedures. The legal traditions that had governed relationships between different ethnic groups within the Hun Confederation contributed to the development of medieval legal systems that accommodated diverse cultural practices within unified political frameworks. The environmental consequences of Hun expansion, while difficult to quantify precisely, likely included significant changes in land use patterns and agricultural practices throughout the regions affected by nomadic migration. The large-scale movement of human and animal populations across traditional territorial boundaries created new pressures on local ecosystems that required adaptations in resource management strategies. The integration of nomadic pastoral practices with sedentary agricultural systems created hybrid economic approaches that would influence European rural development throughout the medieval period. The linguistic influences that resulted from Hun expansion and the subsequent integration of nomadic populations with Germanic and Roman societies created new vocabularies and communication systems that reflected the cultural synthesis of the post-Roman period. The adoption of Hun military terminology by Germanic languages, the integration of nomadic administrative concepts into Latin legal traditions, and the development of new diplomatic vocabularies all demonstrate the linguistic consequences of cultural contact during the expansion period. The preservation of Hun personal names and tribal designations in medieval sources indicates the persistence of nomadic cultural memory despite political fragmentation and territorial displacement. The religious and spiritual transformations that accompanied the final dissolution of Hun identity reflected the broader Christianization of European society during the late 5th century. The conversion of Hun populations to Christianity, while often superficial initially, represented a fundamental cultural shift that accelerated their integration into sedentary societies. The adaptation of Christian religious practices to accommodate traditional nomadic spiritual beliefs created hybrid religious traditions that would influence European folk religion throughout the medieval period. The role of Christian missionaries in facilitating the cultural transformation of nomadic populations demonstrates the importance of religious conversion in the broader process of European cultural unification. By 500 CE, the transformation of Hun populations from independent nomadic confederations to integrated components of medieval European society was essentially complete. The scattered communities that preserved memories of their nomadic heritage lacked the political organization, military capabilities, and territorial control necessary to maintain independent political identity. The cultural practices that had distinguished Hun society from their sedentary neighbours had been gradually abandoned or transformed beyond recognition. The composite bow technology, horse archery techniques, and pastoral nomadism that had characterized Hun military and economic life had been either abandoned or integrated into the broader cultural traditions of medieval Europe. The final disappearance of Hun political identity represented the end of the last great nomadic expansion into Europe until the Mongol invasions of the 13th century. The success of sedentary societies in absorbing and transforming nomadic populations demonstrated the resilience of agricultural and urban civilizations when faced with nomadic challenges. The integration of Hun populations into medieval European society created cultural syntheses that enriched European civilization while eliminating the political independence that had characterized nomadic society during its period of expansion. The historical legacy of the Huns extends far beyond their brief period of political dominance to encompass their fundamental role in the transformation of ancient Europe into the medieval world. Their military innovations revolutionized European warfare, their political practices influenced medieval governmental structures, and their cultural contributions enriched European civilization. The demographic upheavals they initiated created the population distributions that would characterize medieval Europe, while their destruction of existing political structures created opportunities for new forms of political organization. The Huns had served as unwitting architects of medieval European civilization, their expansion and subsequent dissolution creating the conditions that would enable the emergence of the cultural and political traditions that would define European development for the next millennium. The study of Hun history provides crucial insights into the processes of cultural transformation, political fragmentation, and demographic change that characterized the transition from ancient to medieval Europe. Their rise and fall demonstrates the complex interactions between environmental factors, political organization, and military technology that determine the success or failure of nomadic societies. Their ultimate absorption into sedentary civilizations illustrates the long-term advantages of agricultural and urban societies over nomadic alternatives, while their cultural contributions demonstrate the enriching effects of cultural contact and synthesis. The Huns had played their role in European history, and by 500 CE had become part of the complex cultural heritage that would shape the medieval world they had helped to create.